The lane is perhaps 12 feet wide at its broadest point, though in places the root systems have narrowed it to 8. Centuries of cartwheels and cattle hooves have worn the path down into the earth itself, cutting a trench through the Norman clay until the embankments rise on either side like the walls of a roofless cathedral. Oak and hazel and blackthorn grow from these walls, their roots exposed and gnarled where the soil has eroded, their branches meeting overhead in a canopy so dense that a man standing at noon might believe it was dusk. In summer, when the leaves are full, the light that reaches the floor of these lanes is green and filtered and strange. The light of an aquarium, the light of a world that exists beneath something else. This is the bocage. This is where tanks came to die. The word itself is French, derived from an older Norman term for a small wood or grove. But what it describes is not a forest. It is a landscape of enclosure, of division, of ancient boundaries made physical and permanent. For 1,000 years, Norman farmers have planted hedgerows to mark the edges of their fields, and those hedgerows have grown into something more than fences. They are living walls, some of them 8 feet high, built on earthen embankments that add another 3 or 4 feet to their height. The hedges themselves are not decorative shrubs, but dense tangles of hawthorn and bramble and wild rose, impenetrable to man and beast alike, rooted so deeply into the embankments that removing them would require not pruning but excavation. Between these walls run the sunken lanes, worn down by centuries of use until they sit 3 or 4 feet below the level of the surrounding fields. A man walking these lanes in peacetime might find them charming, even romantic, shaded corridors through a pastoral landscape, cool in summer, sheltered from the wind. A man fighting in these lanes in the summer of 1944 found them something else entirely. He found them killing grounds. The geometry is simple and terrible. A tank entering a sunken lane immediately loses its primary advantages: mobility and fields of fire. The embankments prevent lateral movement. The canopy obscures aerial observation. The curves and bends, and these lanes curve constantly, following property lines laid down in the age of Charlemagne, limit forward visibility to 50 yards, sometimes 30, sometimes less. A tank commander standing in his cupola cannot see over the hedgerows to his flanks. He cannot see the sky. He can see only the lane ahead, the green tunnel stretching forward into shadow, and whatever waits around the next bend. What waits around the next bend, in August of 1944, is often a man with a tube on his shoulder and a prayer on his lips. The Panzer IV was not designed for this. Nothing was designed for this. The tank that had swept across the steppes of Russia and the deserts of North Africa, the tank that had broken Polish cavalry charges and shattered French defensive lines, the tank that represented the apotheosis of German armoured doctrine. This machine became something else in the bocage. It became a target. It became blind. It became, for 11 seconds on a morning in early August, a steel coffin moving at walking speed toward men it could not see. The men who understood this first would live. The men who did not would burn. They called themselves Old Hickory, after the general who had beaten the British at New Orleans and gone on to become the 7th President of the United States. Andrew Jackson had been born on the border between the Carolinas, had made his name in Tennessee, had embodied a certain kind of American stubbornness that the men of the 30th Infantry Division recognized in themselves. They were National Guard, most of them, which meant they were not professional soldiers but citizens who had trained on weekends and summer encampments, who had held jobs and raised families and gone to church on Sundays before the war pulled them away from all of it. They came from small towns in North Carolina and South Carolina, from the red clay hills of Georgia, from the valleys of eastern Tennessee. They were farm boys who knew how to read weather and track deer, and fix machinery that had broken down miles from the nearest mechanic. They were mill workers who had spent years tending looms in the textile factories that lined the rivers of the Piedmont. Men who understood the relationship between monotony and vigilance, who knew how to stay alert through 12-hour shifts of repetitive labour. They were the sons and grandsons of Confederate veterans, raised on stories of a lost war, and now they found themselves fighting in France for a cause their great-grandfathers might not have recognised. The division had been established in the summer of 1917, when the United States entered the First Great War, assembled from National Guard units across the southeastern states and given a number and a nickname, and shipped across the Atlantic to fight in the trenches of the Western Front. They had arrived too late to see much action, but the division had survived, had been maintained through the lean years between the wars, had been activated again when the Second Great War began. By the summer of 1944, the 30th Infantry Division was something different from what it had been in 1917. It was no longer a collection of weekend warriors playing at soldiering. It was a combat division that had been tested and bloodied and hardened into something formidable. They had landed on Omaha Beach on the 11th of June 1944, 5 days after the initial assault, stepping onto sand that still bore the scars of that terrible morning, the burned-out hulks of landing craft, the craters from naval bombardment, the graves already marked with white crosses. They had moved inland immediately, pushing toward the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, and within days they had entered the bocage and discovered what the hedgerow country would demand of them. The fighting in the weeks that followed was unlike anything American military doctrine had prepared them for. The open warfare that had characterized the North African campaign, the sweeping armoured thrusts that had broken the German lines in Sicily, none of it applied here. In the bocage, every field became a separate battle. Every hedgerow concealed defenders. Every sunken lane offered the enemy perfect positions for ambush. The division advanced not in miles but in hundreds of yards, sometimes in dozens of yards, paying for each gain in blood. By the time Operation Cobra commenced on the 25th of July, the 30th Division had been fighting continuously for 6 weeks. They had learned the bocage, they had learned how to clear hedgerows with explosive charges, and how to coordinate infantry with armour in terrain that seemed designed to separate them. They had learned which men could be trusted to hold a position, and which men would break under fire. They had buried friends in Norman soil and written letters to mothers and wives that said nothing of what they had seen. They were no longer the National Guard division that had shipped out from the States. They were something harder now, something more dangerous. And then, on the morning of July 25th, their own Air Force had bombed them. Operation Cobra was designed to break the stalemate in Normandy, to use massive aerial bombardment to shatter the German lines and allow American armour to pour through the gap. The plan called for heavy bombers to saturate a rectangular target zone south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier road, pulverizing the German defences before the ground assault began. But something went wrong. The bombers approached from the north instead of the east, flying perpendicular to the American lines rather than parallel to them, and when the lead aircraft released their payloads, the bombs fell short. They fell on American positions. They fell on the 30th Infantry Division. 25 men died in those first moments. 130 more were wounded. The division had been preparing to advance, had been waiting for the bombardment to lift so they could move forward into the shattered German positions, and instead they found themselves under attack from their own aircraft. The confusion was absolute. Men dove into foxholes and ditches, pressed themselves against hedgerows, screamed for medics who were themselves wounded or dead. The bombs kept falling. The earth heaved and split. And when it was over, when the last aircraft had passed and the smoke began to clear, the men of the 30th Division had to pick themselves up and advance anyway, had to attack through the gap that had been blasted open at such terrible cost, had to pretend that the army they served had not just tried to kill them. They did it. They advanced. They broke through the German lines and pushed south and east, part of the great wheeling movement that would eventually encircle the German forces in Normandy and destroy them. By the 6th of August, they had reached the town of Morton, a small market town in the hills south of Avranches, and there they relieved the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, which had been holding the position for several days. The relief was routine. The 30th Division settled into its new positions, established its command posts, sent out patrols to map the surrounding terrain. The men were exhausted but experienced. They knew the bocage now. They knew what to expect. What they did not know, what no one on the American side fully understood, was that Adolf Hitler had personally ordered a massive counterattack aimed directly at them. The plan was called Operation Lüttich, named for the German word for Liège, the Belgian city where German forces had achieved a crucial early victory in 1914. Hitler believed that the American breakout from Normandy had created an opportunity rather than a disaster. The American forces pushing south and east had extended themselves, had stretched their supply lines, had left their flank exposed. If a powerful armoured force could strike westward from Mortagne to the coast at Avranches, it would cut the American spearhead off from its base, would trap Patton's Third Army south of the breach, would reverse the entire strategic situation in Normandy. It was a bold plan, an audacious plan, the kind of plan that had worked brilliantly in 1940 when German armour had sliced through the Allied lines and reached the English Channel in days. But this was not 1940. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was not the Wehrmacht of 1940. The panzer divisions that Hitler ordered to attack at Mortain were shadows of their former selves, depleted by years of fighting on the Eastern Front, short of fuel and ammunition and replacement vehicles. The element of surprise, which had been so crucial to German success in the early years of the war, was largely absent. Allied intelligence had detected the concentration of German armour and warned the American commanders that an attack was coming. And the terrain around Mortain was not the open country that favoured armoured warfare. It was bocage, it was hedgerow country, it was the worst possible ground for tanks. The attack began in the early hours of August 7th, 1944. 4 German divisions, including elements of the elite 1st SS Panzer Division and 2nd SS Panzer Division, struck the American lines around Mortain with everything they had. The initial assault achieved some success. German tanks penetrated into the town itself, and American forward positions were overrun in several places. But the 30th Division did not break. It bent, it gave ground in places, but it did not break. The men who had survived the bocage fighting since June, who had endured the friendly fire of Operation Cobra, who had marched and fought and bled their way across Normandy, these men held their positions and fought back with whatever weapons they had. The problem was that the weapons they had were not always adequate to the task. The standard American anti-tank gun in the summer of 1944 was the 57mm M1, a weapon that had been designed to defeat the tanks of an earlier era. Against the Panzer IV, with its 80mm of frontal armour, the 57mm was essentially useless. The rounds simply bounced off. American gun crews watched in horror as their carefully aimed shots sparked against German armour and ricocheted away, leaving the tanks unharmed and still advancing. The official after-action reports would describe the 57mm guns as all but useless against the heavy German tanks. The men who crewed those guns would use stronger language. This left the infantry with one reliable weapon against German armour, the bazooka, and the bazooka, as every man who carried one understood, was a weapon of desperation. The M1A1 bazooka was, in its way, a revolutionary weapon. It was the first rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon to see widespread combat use, a shoulder-fired launcher that allowed a single infantryman, or more accurately a 2-man team, to engage and destroy armoured vehicles that would otherwise require artillery or air support to neutralise. The concept was simple. A shaped charge warhead, propelled by a small rocket motor, could penetrate armour far thicker than any conventional bullet or shell of the same calibre. The warhead did not rely on kinetic energy, on the brute force of a heavy projectile moving at high velocity. Instead, it used the Munro effect, the principle that an explosive charge with a hollow cavity lined with metal will, upon detonation, focus its energy into a superplastic jet of molten copper moving at nearly 5 miles per second. This jet could punch through steel plate like a needle through cloth, creating a small but lethal hole that sprayed the interior of the target with fragments and superheated gas. The weapon itself was crude by the standards of later anti-tank systems. It consisted of a steel tube, roughly 54 inches long and 2¼ inches in diameter, open at both ends to allow the rocket's exhaust to escape. The tube was fitted with simple iron sights, a wooden shoulder stock, and an electrical firing mechanism powered by 2 flashlight batteries. The rocket itself was a 2.36-inch projectile, with a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating 3.5 to 4 inches of steel armour, enough to defeat most tanks of the early war period, enough to threaten the side and rear armour of heavier vehicles, but nowhere near enough to penetrate the frontal armour of a Panzer IV. The specifications told the story. The Panzer IV, by January of 1943, had been upgraded with 80mm of frontal armour, more than 3 inches of hardened steel, sloped at an angle that effectively increased its thickness against incoming projectiles. The bazooka's maximum penetration of 4 inches, achieved only under ideal conditions, was simply insufficient. A bazooka round striking the front of a Panzer IV would detonate against the glacis plate and accomplish nothing. The tank would keep coming. The crew inside would feel the impact, might hear the shaped charge expend itself uselessly against their armour, and then they would traverse their turret and kill the men who had fired at them. The side armour was different. The Panzer IV's hull sides measured only 30mm, barely more than an inch of steel. The rear armour was thinner still, just 20mm. These surfaces were well within the bazooka's penetration envelope. A rocket striking the side or rear of a Panzer IV at a favourable angle would punch through the armour and fill the fighting compartment with molten copper and high-velocity fragments. The crew would die. The tank would burn. But achieving that side or rear shot required getting close. Very close. The bazooka's maximum range was listed as 300 yards, but this was a theoretical figure that bore little relationship to combat reality. At 300 yards, the slow-moving rocket was easily deflected by crosswinds, and the primitive sights made accurate aim nearly impossible. The effective range, the range at which a competent gunner could reasonably expect to hit a moving target, was closer to 100 yards, and even this assumed ideal conditions. Against a tank that was actively manoeuvring, that was aware of the threat and taking evasive action, the practical engagement range dropped further still. And there was another problem, one that the specifications did not fully capture. Even a perfect side shot at 100 yards might not be enough. The shaped charged jet lost coherence over distance, spreading and weakening as it travelled through the air before impact. The closer the shooter was to the target, the more focused the jet would be when it struck the armour, the more likely it was to achieve full penetration. The men who used bazookas in combat learned this lesson quickly. They learned that the weapon was most reliable at ranges that seemed suicidal. 50 yards, 30 yards, close enough to see the rivets on the hull, close enough to smell the diesel exhaust, close enough that a miss meant death. This was the mathematics of the bazooka. This was the equation that every anti-tank team had to solve. The weapon could kill a Panzer IV, but only if the shooter could get within 30 yards of the tank's flank or rear without being seen, without being heard, without being killed by the machine guns or the main gun or the infantry that often accompanied German armour. The bazooka was not a weapon that allowed for error. It was not a weapon that forgave poor positioning or bad timing or simple bad luck. It was a weapon that demanded perfection, and it punished anything less with death. The men who carried bazookas understood this. They understood that their weapon was, in a very real sense, inadequate to the task it was designed to perform. They understood that engaging a tank with a bazooka was not a tactical choice, but a last resort. Something you did when there was no artillery available, no air support, no 57mm guns that might at least force the tank to button up and lose visibility. They understood that the bazooka was a weapon of desperation, a weapon for men who had no other options, a weapon that asked its users to do something that violated every instinct of self-preservation, to move toward the thing that was trying to kill them, to get closer to the machine guns and the cannon and the grinding treads, to bet their lives on a single shot from a tube that might or might not fire, at a target that might or might not be penetrated, from a range that might or might not be close enough. And yet they did it. At Mortain, in the first days of August 1944, they did it again and again. When the German armour came through the hedgerows, when the 57mm guns proved useless, and the artillery was out of range and the fighter-bombers were grounded by morning fog, the men of the 30th Infantry Division picked up their bazookas and went hunting. Private First Class Joseph Shipley was a telephone switchboard operator, a man whose military specialty had nothing to do with anti-tank warfare. He had never fired a bazooka before the morning of August 7th. But when German tanks broke through his unit's position, when the situation became desperate enough that every man was needed regardless of his training, Shipley picked up a bazooka and taught himself how to use it. He knocked out 2 German tanks that morning, firing from ranges close enough to guarantee penetration, close enough that the crews inside never had a chance to react. He survived. Many others did not. The accounts from Mortain describe a kind of combat that had more in common with hunting than with conventional warfare. American soldiers stalked German tanks through the hedgerows, using the terrain that had caused them so much suffering in the weeks before as cover for their approach. They hid in ditches and behind embankments. They used haystacks and farm buildings and anything else that might conceal their positions. They waited for the tanks to pass, then fired into the vulnerable rear armour before the crews could react. They died in large numbers, killed by machine gun fire or main gun rounds, or simply crushed beneath the treads of tanks they had failed to stop. But they also killed tanks. They killed enough tanks that the German offensive stalled, that the armoured spearhead aimed at Avranches never reached its objective, that Operation Lüttich became not a strategic masterstroke but a catastrophic failure. The 30th Division would suffer over 1,800 casualties at Mortain, killed, wounded and missing, in less than a week of fighting. It was a terrible price, but the division held, the line did not break. And when the fighting was over, when the German forces began their long retreat eastward toward the Seine and beyond, the men of Old Hickory could say that they had stopped the last great German offensive in the West. They had done it with courage and determination and a willingness to die. They had also done it with a weapon that should not have been adequate to the task, a weapon that worked only because the men who carried it were willing to do things that no reasonable person would ask of them. The bazooka was not a good anti-tank weapon, it was merely the weapon they had. And in the bocage, in the sunken lanes where tanks could not manoeuvre, and visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, it was enough. The story of what happened on one of those lanes, the story of a haystack and a manure cart and 11 seconds that ended 2 German tanks, is a story about the mathematics of desperation. It is a story about what happens when men understand their weapons' limitations so completely that they can turn those limitations into advantages. It is a story about terrain and timing and the terrible intimacy of killing at close range. But before we can tell that story, we must understand the machine that the bazooka was designed to destroy. We must understand the Panzer IV, what it was, what it could do, and why the bocage transformed it from a weapon of conquest into a target waiting to be killed. The Panzer IV had been the backbone of the German armoured force since the beginning of the war. It was not the most famous German tank. That honour belonged to the Tiger, with its fearsome 88mm gun and nearly impenetrable armour. But it was the most numerous, the most reliable, the most versatile. More Panzer IVs were built than any other German tank of the war, and they served on every front in every campaign, from the invasion of Poland in 1939 to the final desperate battles in the streets of Berlin in 1945. The design philosophy behind the Panzer IV reflected German armoured doctrine of the late 1930s. It was intended to be a support tank, a vehicle that would accompany the lighter Panzer III into battle and provide heavy fire support against fortified positions and infantry concentrations. Its original armament was a short-barreled 75mm gun optimised for firing high explosive shells rather than armour-piercing rounds. Its armour was adequate for the threats of its era but not exceptional. It was designed to be part of a combined arms team, working alongside infantry and aircraft and other tanks, not to fight alone against enemy armour. The war changed everything. As German forces encountered heavier Allied tanks, the British Matilda, the Soviet T-34 and KV-1, the Panzer IV was progressively upgraded to meet the new threats. The short-barreled gun was replaced with a long-barreled high-velocity weapon capable of defeating enemy armour at range. The armour was thickened, first with additional plates bolted to the hull, then with a complete redesign that increased frontal protection to 80mm. Skirt armour was added to protect the tracks and running gear from anti-tank rifles and shaped charge weapons. By 1944, the Panzer IV had evolved from a support tank into a main battle tank, a vehicle that could engage any Allied armour on roughly equal terms. On the open battlefields of Russia, on the flat expanses of the North African desert, the Panzer IV was a formidable weapon. Its long-barreled gun could kill a Sherman at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Its armour could defeat most Allied anti-tank weapons at anything beyond point-blank range. Its crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, were among the best-trained tank crews in the world, veterans of years of armoured warfare who understood their vehicle's capabilities and limitations with an intimacy born of constant combat. But the bocage was not Russia. It was not North Africa. It was a landscape that negated almost everything that made the Panzer IV dangerous. The long-barreled gun that could kill at 1,000 yards was useless when visibility was limited to 50. The thick frontal armour that could shrug off anti-tank rounds was irrelevant when the enemy was attacking from the side or rear. The superior training of the crew counted for little when the terrain prevented them from using their skills, when the hedgerows blocked their fields of fire, and the sunken lanes channeled their movement into predictable paths. In the bocage, the Panzer IV was not a predator. It was prey. The tank commanders understood this. They knew that every sunken lane was a potential ambush site, that every hedgerow might conceal an American soldier with a bazooka or a rifle grenade or a satchel charge. They knew that their vehicles, so dominant in open country, became vulnerable in the close terrain of the Norman countryside. But they had their orders. Operation Lüttich demanded that they advance, that they push through the American lines and reach the coast, that they accomplish in August what they had failed to accomplish in June. And so they advanced, buttoning up their hatches to protect against small arms fire, peering through vision slits that reduced their already limited visibility to narrow rectangles of green shadow, moving forward into a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. The fog helped on the morning of August 7th. The thick ground fog that blanketed the Norman countryside in the early hours concealed the German approach from American observers, and more importantly from the fighter bombers that had been devastating German armour columns for weeks. The fog gave the tanks cover, allowed them to move forward without fear of air attack, created the conditions for surprise that the operation required. But the fog also helped the Americans. It concealed their positions as effectively as it concealed the German advance. It allowed bazooka teams to move into ambush positions without being spotted. It turned the already limited visibility of the bocage into something approaching blindness. When the fog lifted, the fighter bombers came. But by then, much of the close-quarters fighting was already over. By then, the men with bazookas had already done their work. The lane that would become the site of the ambush was unremarkable by the standards of the bocage. It ran roughly east to west, connecting two slightly larger roads, serving as a shortcut for farmers moving between fields. The embankments on either side were perhaps 8 feet high, topped with hedgerows that added another 4 or 5 feet of impenetrable vegetation. The canopy met overhead, creating the characteristic green tunnel that defined movement through the Norman countryside. The lane curved gently, following the contours of the land, and at one point it passed between a haystack on the south side and a manure cart that had been abandoned on the north. The haystack was old, weathered by rain and sun, its outer layers grey and compacted. The manure cart was a simple wooden affair, the kind that Norman farmers had been using for centuries, filled with the accumulated waste of cattle and horses that would eventually be spread on the fields as fertilizer. Neither object was remarkable. Neither would have attracted a second glance from anyone passing through. Together they formed the elements of a killing ground. The men who would use them understood something that the German tank commanders did not. They understood that the bocage was not merely difficult terrain. It was terrain that inverted the normal relationships of armoured warfare. In open country, the tank was the hunter, and the infantryman was the prey. In the bocage, those roles were reversed. The tank was blind, constrained, predictable. The infantryman was mobile, concealed, patient. The tank had to move through the lanes because there was no other way to move. The infantryman could choose his position, could wait for the perfect moment, could strike from a direction the tank could not anticipate. The mathematics were simple, once you understood them. The bazooka could kill a Panzer sifter, but only at close range, only from the side or rear. The bocage provided the close range. The hedgerows provided the concealment. The sunken lanes provided the predictable approach routes. All that remained was to choose the right position, to build the right blind, to wait for the right moment. The men of the 30th Division had learned these lessons in the weeks since they landed at Omaha Beach. They had paid for those lessons in blood, and now, in the early hours of August 7th, they would apply what they had learned. The haystack would hide them, the manure cart would mark the range, the lane would deliver their targets, and when the Panzers came around the bend, moving at walking speed through the green tunnel, their commanders blind behind buttoned hatches, their crews unaware of what waited in the shadows. When that moment came, the mathematics of the bazooka would finally work in their favour. 11 seconds. That was all it would take. 11 seconds to fire, to reload, to fire again. 11 seconds to kill 2 tanks and escape into the hedgerows before the Germans could react. 11 seconds that would demonstrate in the most visceral way possible what happened when a weapon designed for the steppes met men who understood the bocage. The lane swallowed light. It would soon swallow fire. The Panzer IV Ausführung H had earned its reputation on the Eastern Front, in the vast killing grounds of Kursk and the endless wheat fields of Ukraine. It was a machine born for distance. Its long-barreled 7.5 centimetre KBUK 40 L48 main gun could reach out and destroy a Soviet T-34 at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. Against the American M4 Sherman, the mathematics were even more favourable. The German gun could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armour from well over a kilometre away. while the Sherman's 75mm gun often struggled to pierce the Panzer IV's 80mm front plate at anything beyond 500 metres. In the open terrain for which it was designed, the Panzer IV was a predator of remarkable efficiency. Its crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, who doubled as bow machine gunner, operated within a choreography refined through years of combat. The commander stood in his cupola, scanning the horizon through 8 vision slits that gave him nearly complete situational awareness. The gunner tracked targets through his telescopic sight, while the loader fed shells into the breach with practiced rhythm. The driver responded to the commander's directions through the intercom, while the radio operator maintained contact with other vehicles in the formation and covered the forward arc with his hull-mounted MG-34. This was modern armoured warfare as the Wehrmacht had perfected it, a symphony of coordination, firepower and mobility that had crushed armies from the Meuse to the Don. But the Bocage was not the steppes. General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzerlehr Division, one of the elite armoured formations committed to the defence of Normandy. He was a veteran of the Afrika Korps, a man who understood tanks as well as any officer in the German army. And in his reports that summer he documented a truth that would cost his men dearly. While the Panzer IV could still be used to advantage in the Norman hedgerow country, the terrain fundamentally altered the conditions under which armoured warfare could be conducted. The Panther tank, wider and heavier, proved ill-adapted to the narrow lanes, but even the more compact Panzer IV found itself constrained in ways its designers had never anticipated. The problems began with geometry. The sunken lanes of the Bocage were rarely wider than 12 feet, barely enough for a single vehicle to pass. The embankments rose on either side, often 3 or 4 feet above the lane's surface, topped by hedgerows that added another 8 feet of dense vegetation. In these conditions, the Panzer IV's turret could not traverse freely. The long barrel of the KG-40 would strike the embankment walls if the gunner attempted to track a target to the side. The turret's maximum traverse speed of 14 degrees per second, adequate for engaging moving targets across open ground, became meaningless when the gun could not be brought to bear at all. A tank that could destroy any Allied vehicle at 1,000 metres became, in these lanes, a steel box with a gun that pointed only forward. The commander's cupola, that elegant solution to battlefield awareness, became a liability. The 8 vision slits that provided near-complete situational awareness in open terrain showed nothing but green walls in the Bocage. The hedgerows pressed in from both sides, their foliage so dense that visibility dropped to 50 yards or less. The commander could see the lane ahead, the lane behind, and nothing else. The approaches from which an enemy might attack, the gaps in the hedgerows, the slight rises in the embankments, the positions that infantry would choose for ambush, remained invisible behind walls of vegetation that the vision slits could not penetrate. And then there was the noise. The Panzer IV's Maybach HL 120 TRM engine produced 300 horsepower through a low rumble that filled the fighting compartment with constant sound. In open country, this was merely the background thrum of operations, easily filtered out by experienced crews. But in the enclosed spaces of the Bocage lanes, where the embankments acted as sound barriers and the hedgerow canopy formed a ceiling that trapped and reflected noise, the engine's roar became something else entirely. It drowned out the sounds that experienced tankers relied upon, the crack of a rifle that signalled infantry nearby, the distinctive whoosh of a rocket launch, the shouted warnings from accompanying foot soldiers. German after-action reports from the summer of 1944 returned again and again to this problem. Crews described feeling as though they were operating inside a sealed chamber, cut off from the auditory cues that had always been part of armoured combat. They could not hear the enemy, they could not hear their own infantry, they could hear only the relentless drumbeat of their own engine echoing off the walls of earth and vegetation that enclosed them. The psychological effects were documented with clinical precision in interrogation transcripts and medical reports. Crews that had fought with distinction on the Eastern Front, that had maintained their composure under artillery bombardment and air attack, reported symptoms that military psychiatrists recognized as acute stress responses. The confinement of the lanes, the inability to see or hear approaching threats, the knowledge that the weapon systems upon which they depended were functionally disabled. These factors combined to produce what German after-action reports consistently identified as crisis points. Commanders who should have been scanning for threats found themselves fixated on the narrow strip of lane visible through their cupolas. Gunners who should have been ready to engage on command sat with their hands on traverse wheels that could not be turned. Loaders who should have been preparing rounds waited in silence, knowing that if contact came, it would come from a direction the main gun could not address. The Panzer IV had been designed to fight wars of manoeuvre across continental distances. Now it found itself reduced to a blind giant, stumbling through corridors too narrow for its weapons to function, crewed by men whose training and experience had prepared them for a kind of combat that no longer existed. The tank that could kill a Sherman at a kilometre became, in these lanes, nothing more than a target. Armoured, yes, but slow, constrained, and deaf to the approach of death. The men inside these machines were not abstractions. They were soldiers, most of them young, many of them veterans of campaigns that had seemed endless. The commander of a Panzer IV typically held the rank of Unteroffizier or Feldwebel, a non-commissioned officer who had earned his position through demonstrated competence and survived long enough to learn his trade. He stood in the cupola because that was where the commander stood, exposed from the chest up when the hatch was open, enclosed in a steel box when it was closed. In the bocage, the choice was binary: keep the hatch open and risk death from sniper fire or shell fragments, or close it and accept blindness. Most chose blindness. Most chose to trust the armour that had protected them before. The gunner sat below and forward of the commander, his eye pressed to the rubber cushion of the telescopic sight, his left hand on the traverse wheel, his right on the elevation hand wheel. He was responsible for putting the main gun on target and keeping it there. In open country, this was a skill that could be practiced and perfected. Leading a moving vehicle, compensating for the tank's own motion, judging distance across featureless terrain. In the bocage, the gunner's skills became almost irrelevant. There was no target acquisition at range. There was no leading of moving vehicles. There was only the narrow lane ahead, and if a target appeared there, it would appear suddenly at close range, already within the gun's minimum effective distance. The loader stood in the turret basket to the left of the gun breech, surrounded by the ammunition stored in racks along the turret walls and in bins below the floor. His job was mechanical but physically demanding, lifting the 6.8 kilogram shells, sliding them into the breech, closing the breech block, calling out, "Loaded," and stepping back before the gun fired and the breech recoiled. A good loader could maintain a rate of fire of 15 rounds per minute, but in the bocage, rate of fire was rarely relevant. The first shot was usually the only shot. Either it hit, or the situation had already become something that no amount of loading could address. The driver and radio operator sat in the forward hull, below the turret, separated from the fighting compartment by steel and machinery. The driver controlled the tank's movement, the clutches, the brakes, the throttle, while peering through a vision slit that showed only the lane directly ahead. The radio operator sat to his left, responsible for communications with headquarters and other vehicles, but also tasked with operating the hull-mounted MG-34 machine gun. In the bocage, his machine gun was as constrained as the main gun. It could fire only forward, at targets directly in the tank's path. These 5 men lived and died together in a steel box measuring roughly 6 meters long and less than 3 meters wide. They breathed the same recycled air, heavy with the smell of gun oil, cordite, and their own bodies. They communicated through a throat microphone intercom system that allowed coordination even over the engine noise. They had trained together, fought together, survived together, and now they found themselves in terrain that negated everything they had learned, everything they had survived to learn. The Panzer IVs that moved through the Normandy bocage in August 1944 constituted roughly half of the available German tank strength on the Western Front. They were the workhorses of the panzer divisions, the reliable core around which armoured operations were built. They had driven through France in 1940, through the Balkans in 1941, through the Soviet Union in 1941, and 1942 and 1943 and 1944. They had been upgraded and up-armoured over the years. The 80mm frontal plate of the Ausführung H was a response to increasingly powerful Allied anti-tank weapons. They had been fitted with Schürzen, the distinctive side skirts designed to detonate shaped charge warheads before they reached the main hull armour. They represented the accumulated experience of 5 years of mechanised warfare. None of it mattered in the bocage. The lanes swallowed these machines as they swallowed everything else. The commanders who had learned to read battlefields through their cupola vision slits found themselves staring at endless walls of green. The gunners who had learned to track targets at 1,000 meters found their guns pointing down corridors where the maximum engagement range was 50 yards. The crews who had learned to work as coordinated teams found their coordination disrupted by noise and confinement, and the particular terror of knowing that death might come from any direction except the one they could see. And death did come. The shaped-charge warhead of the American bazooka was not designed to penetrate the Panzer IV's 80mm frontal armour, but the side armour was only 30mm thick. The rear armour was thinner still, and in the sunken lanes of the bocage, where tanks could not manoeuvre, could not traverse their turrets, could not see or hear the approach of infantry with the rocket launchers, in those lanes, the mathematics finally worked against the Panzer. The weapon that could not touch the front could kill through the side. The weapon that required suicidal courage on open ground required only patience in the hedgerows. The weapon of desperation became, in this terrain, a weapon of calculated murder. This was the reality that the tank crews faced as they moved through the Norman countryside in the first weeks of August 1944. This was the context in which two Panzerthers would soon come around a bend in a sunken lane, moving at walking pace through a green tunnel, their commanders blind behind buttoned hatches, their crews straining to hear anything over the engine roar, their main guns pointing uselessly forward at nothing. They did not know about the haystack. They did not know about the manure cart. They did not know that men were waiting in the shadows with weapons designed for exactly this moment, this range, this angle of attack. They knew only that they had orders, and that the orders required them to move through terrain that wanted them dead. The orders came from the highest levels of the German command structure. They came, ultimately, from Hitler himself. Unternehmen Lüttich, Operation Liege, was born of desperation dressed as audacity. By early August 1944, the German position in Normandy had become untenable. The American breakout at St. Lô, codenamed Operation Cobra, had shattered the German defensive line in the west. General George Patton's Third Army was pouring through the gap, racing south and then east, threatening to unhinge the entire German position in France. The careful defensive war that Field Marshal von Kluge had been fighting since the invasion was collapsing. Something had to be done. Hitler's solution was characteristic of his strategic thinking in the later years of the war. A massive armoured counterattack that ignored logistics, ignored air supremacy, ignored the warnings of commanders on the ground. The objective was Avranches, the small town at the southwestern corner of the Cotentin Peninsula, through which the entire Third Army supply line ran. If German forces could capture Avranches and hold it, Patton's spearhead would be cut off. The breakthrough would become a trap. The entire American advance would stall, while German forces consolidated their position. It was not an impossible plan. It was not even an unreasonable plan, viewed from the map tables at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The distance from the German positions around Mortain to Avranches was less than 30 kilometres. The terrain, while difficult, could be traversed in a single day's hard fighting. The forces available, 4 armoured divisions with approximately 300 tanks, were sufficient for a penetration if concentrated at the decisive point. On paper, the operation had a chance, but paper could not account for what waited in the hedgerows. The main striking force of Operation Lüttich was the Eastersley Panzer Corps, commanded by General Hans Freiherr von Funk. His corps comprised elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, and the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Elite formations with proud histories and experienced cadres, the 2nd SS Panzer Division das Reich contributed additional forces. On paper, this was an assemblage of armoured might sufficient to crush any opposition. In practice, the divisions were under strength, their tank parks depleted by weeks of continuous combat, their infantry complements reduced to fractions of authorised levels. The 300 tanks represented not fresh reserves, but the accumulated remnants of formations that had been fighting since D-Day. The attack began on August 7, 1944, in the pre-dawn darkness. The same fog that would conceal the American bazooka teams initially worked to German advantage, grounding the Allied fighter bombers that had made daylight movements suicidal. German armoured columns pushed west through the town of Mortain, achieving initial penetrations and in some sectors, breaking through the thin American screening forces. For a few hours it seemed as though the operation might succeed, but the Americans held at the crucial points. The 30th Infantry Division had relieved the 1st Infantry Division in the Mortain sector on August 6th, just one day before the German attack. The men of Old Hickory were tired, under strength themselves after weeks of hedgerow fighting, still recovering from the catastrophic friendly fire bombing during Operation Cobra that had killed 25 of their number and wounded more than 130. They were not fresh, they were not at full strength, but they were there, in the path of the German advance, and they would not move. What followed was some of the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the Normandy campaign. The 30th Division's forward units found themselves encircled, cut off, fighting from hilltop positions and farmhouses and hedgerow lines with whatever weapons they had at hand. The 57mm anti-tank guns that were supposed to stop German armour proved unable to penetrate the Panzer IV's frontal plate. The rounds simply bounced off. The only effective weapons were the bazookas, and using them required getting close enough to die. The fighting lasted from August 7th through August 12th, 6 days in which the division suffered more than 1,800 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. 6 days in which German armoured columns repeatedly tried to break through to Avranches and repeatedly failed. 6 days in which bazooka teams crawled through hedgerows and waited in sunken lanes, and died in numbers that would never be precisely counted. The Germans lost over 120 tanks and assault guns, more than 2/3 of the armoured strength they had committed. The offensive that was supposed to cut Patton's supply line succeeded only in pushing German armoured reserves into a salient that would soon become a trap. Within days, the Falaise pocket would close around the German 7th Army, and the destruction would be so complete that the roads would be choked with burned vehicles and bodies for weeks afterward. But all of that lay in the future. On the morning of August 7th, as the fog began to lift and the sounds of fighting echoed across the Norman countryside, none of it was certain. What was certain was that German tanks were moving through the bocage, pushing toward objectives that headquarters had designated on maps that bore little relationship to the terrain. What was certain was that American infantry was in their path, armed with weapons that could kill only at close range. What was certain was that somewhere in those endless lanes and hedgerows, the geometry of armoured warfare was about to be inverted one more time. The 2 Panzer IVs that would come down the sunken lane near Mortagne were part of this larger offensive, cogs in a machine designed to punch through to Avranches. Their commanders had orders. Their orders required them to move west, to advance, to find and destroy American positions. The lane was a shortcut, a way to bypass the larger roads where American artillery might have prepared kill zones. It was the kind of route that tank commanders chose when they were under pressure to move quickly, to make ground, to reach objectives before the fog lifted and the fighter bombers returned. This was the operational context that brought them to that bend in the lane. This was the urgency that made them move faster than caution allowed. The strategic situation demanded speed. Hitler demanded speed. The whole collapsing edifice of German strategy in Normandy demanded that these tanks reach their objectives before it was too late. And so they came around the bend, moving at walking pace, because the lane permitted nothing faster, their commanders blind because they had buttoned their hatches against the threat of snipers, their guns pointing forward because there was no room to traverse, their crews unable to hear anything over the rumble of 300 horsepower echoing off the hedgerow walls. They did not know they were already dead. They did not know that in the shadows of the lane, hidden behind a weathered haystack and marked by a manure cart that would serve as a range marker, men were waiting with a weapon designed for exactly this moment. They did not know that the terrain they were passing through was not terrain at all. It was a trap, a killing ground, an ambush site chosen by men who understood the bocage in ways that no German tactical manual had anticipated. The first tank came around the bend, the second followed at the standard interval, and somewhere in the shadows, a bazooka team made final preparations for 11 seconds of calculated violence. The men who would spring the ambush had been studying ground like this for weeks. Not in classrooms or sand tables, there had been no time for that, but in the hedgerows themselves, learning through attrition what worked and what got you killed. By early August, the survivors of those lessons had developed an intuition for terrain that no manual could have taught them. They looked at a sunken lane and saw angles. They looked at a bend and saw opportunity. They looked at a haystack and saw concealment. They looked at a manure cart and saw a range marker. The position they chose was not random. It was the product of hard calculation made under impossible pressure, the kind of thinking that happens when men know they will have one chance and no margin for error. The bend in the lane was the first requirement. A Panzer IV moving in a straight line could see several hundred yards ahead, even in bocage country, and its 7.5 centimetre gun could reach out and kill anything it could see. But a bend changed everything. A bend forced the tank to slow. A bend limited the driver's visibility. A bend created a moment, brief, perhaps 5 or 6 seconds, when the tank was committed to the turn but had not yet completed it, when its gun was pointing in the wrong direction and its commander was focused on navigation rather than threat detection. That moment was everything. That moment was the window in which a bazooka team could fire, hit, and perhaps survive. The lane they selected curved around the base of a slight rise, the kind of gentle undulation that was invisible on maps but decisive on the ground. The hedgerow on the outer edge of the curve grew thick and high, fed by decades of accumulated soil and moisture in the drainage ditch that ran along its base. The inner edge was lower, the embankment partially collapsed from years of farm traffic, but still high enough to channel any vehicle through a predictable path. A tank coming down that lane had no choice but to follow the curve. Its driver could see the bend coming, could slow in anticipation, but could not change the geometry. The lane was the lane. The curve was the curve. Physics dictated the rest. The haystack sat on the inner side of the bend, set back perhaps 15 feet from the lane itself. It was an old stack, weathered grey by a season's exposure, partially collapsed on one side where rain had penetrated the outer layer. To a German observer, if any German observer had been looking, it was unremarkable. Haystacks dotted the Norman landscape by the thousands. They were part of the visual furniture of the countryside, so common that the eye slid past them without registering their presence. This was exactly why the bazooka team chose it. The haystack was invisible because it was ordinary. It was concealment through banality. But the position offered more than concealment. It offered geometry. A bazooka round had to hit a tank's flank or rear armour to have any chance of penetrating. The front glacis plate of a Panzer IV was 80 millimeters thick, sloped to increase effective thickness, proof against any shaped charge the Americans could throw at it. But the side armour was only 30 millimeters. The rear was only 20. At those thicknesses, a bazooka round could punch through, could send its jet of superheated copper into the crew compartment or the engine, could turn a tank from a weapon into a coffin. The geometry of the bend gave the team that flank shot. As the tank came around the curve, its side would be presented to the haystack position for perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, long enough for a trained crew to aim, fire, and watch the round fly the 30 yards to the target. The angle was not perfect. The angle was never perfect, but it was good enough. It was the best this lane offered. Behind the haystack, the ground fell away into a drainage ditch that ran toward the next hedgerow line. This was the escape route, the secondary consideration that could become the primary one if the ambush failed. A bazooka team that killed a tank but could not escape was a dead bazooka team. The Germans would respond. They always responded. Artillery, infantry, or surviving tank crews would sweep the ambush site within minutes of any engagement. The team needed to be gone before that happened. The drainage ditch gave them a covered route to the next hedgerow, and from there to a series of farm paths that led back toward American lines. It was not a guarantee. Nothing was a guarantee. But it was a chance, and in bocage fighting, a chance was all anyone could ask for. The manure cart completed the position. It sat in the lane itself, abandoned where some farmer had left it in the chaos of the previous day's fighting. Perhaps its owner had fled when the shelling started. Perhaps he had been killed. Perhaps he had simply unhitched his horse and run, leaving the cart where it stood because nothing else mattered when shells were falling. However it came to be there, the cart now served a purpose its maker had never imagined. Range estimation with a bazooka was difficult under the best conditions. The weapon had no sophisticated sighting system, just a simple rear aperture and a front blade. The same basic arrangement that had aimed rifles since the 19th century. Estimating 30 or 40 yards through that sight, in the heat of combat, with your target moving and your hands shaking from fear and adrenaline, was an exercise in controlled guessing. But the cart gave the team a fixed reference point. They could measure the distance from their position to the cart, 32 yards, according to the geometry they had paced out earlier, and know that when the tank reached the cart it was in range. No guessing, no estimating. When the tank's front sprocket came even with that cart, the loader would tap the gunner's shoulder and the gunner would fire. The cart was a trigger, a mechanical solution to a human problem. Some accounts mention another function for the cart, the smell. A manure cart, even one that had sat in the August sun for several days, retained an odour powerful enough to mask other scents. German armoured columns sometimes advanced with infantry screening their flanks, and that infantry sometimes included handlers with dogs trained to detect ambushes. The dogs could smell human beings, could smell the oil that soldiers used to clean their weapons, could smell the particular chemical signature of fear, but they could not smell those things through a wall of agricultural waste. The cart was not just a range marker, it was camouflage of a different kind, a barrier against senses that the team could not otherwise defeat. Whether the team thought about the dogs, whether they deliberately positioned themselves downwind of the cart, whether this was calculation or coincidence, the records do not say. What the records do say is that the Germans did not detect the position until it was too late. Whatever combination of haystack and cart and terrain and discipline concealed the team, it worked. The ambush was invisible until it became lethal. The hours before contact stretched into a particular kind of silence. The team moved into position before dawn, crawling the last 100 yards through the wet grass to avoid any chance of being seen. The fog that rolled in with the first light of August 7th helped, softening sounds and blurring shapes, turning the world into a grey uncertainty where nothing was quite real. They settled into the haystack and became still. Stillness was survival. A moving shape drew the eye, a flash of skin, a shift of position, the glint of metal in uncertain light. Any of these could betray a position and bring down fire. The men in the haystack understood this. They had learned it in the weeks since they landed in Normandy, learned it from watching friends die because they moved when they should have been still. So they did not move. They lay in the hay with their weapon and their rounds and their fear, and they waited. The waiting was its own form of combat. The body did not want to be still. The muscles cramped, the bladder filled, insects crawled across exposed skin and could not be brushed away. The hay prickled and stabbed, working its way through fabric to irritate flesh. The fog dampened everything, soaking uniforms, chilling bodies that could not move to generate warmth. And through all of it, the mind ran scenarios. What if the tanks came from a different direction? What if there were 3 tanks instead of 2? What if infantry came first and found the position before the armour arrived? What if the round failed to fire? What if it fired but failed to penetrate? What if? What if? What if? The endless multiplication of disaster that was the true enemy of men in ambush. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. The German attack had begun in the early hours of August 7th, and by dawn the fighting had spread across the entire Morton sector. The 30th Division was under assault from multiple directions, its positions probed by German armour and infantry looking for weak points to exploit. The men in the haystack could hear the battle without seeing it. The crump of shells, the rattle of machine guns, the occasional deeper boom of a tank cannon. They could not know whether their own lines were holding. They could not know whether relief was coming or whether they were about to be cut off. They could only lie in the hay and listen and wait for whatever came down the lane. The Americans in this sector had received warning that the attack was coming. Ultra Intercepts had given headquarters a complete picture of Operation Lüttich by August 4th, 3 days before the Germans jumped off. The 30th Division's records show that by 38 minutes after midnight on August 7th, frontline units had been warned of a possible enemy counterattack from the east or north within 12 hours. By 4 in the morning the picture was clear. German armour was coming, and it was coming in strength. But knowing that an attack was coming and knowing where it would strike were different things. The warning had allowed the division to prepare, to position reserves, to alert anti-tank teams like the one hidden in the haystack. It had not told them exactly which lane the tanks would use, exactly when they would arrive, exactly how many there would be. That remained uncertain until the moment it became certain, until the sound of engines and the clank of tracks announced that the waiting was over. The fog that blanketed the bocage that morning was both blessing and curse. It grounded the fighter bombers that had been savaging German columns for weeks, the P-47s and Typhoons that could turn an armoured advance into a burning junkyard in minutes. Without air cover, the German tanks could move openly, could push down roads that would have been suicide in clear weather. But the fog also blinded the tankers themselves. Their commanders could not see obstacles, could not spot ambushes, could not coordinate with units on their flanks. The same weather that protected them from the sky exposed them to the ground. The men in the haystack listened to the sounds that filtered through the fog and tried to build a picture of what was happening. Vehicle engines growled somewhere to the east, heavy engines, the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles labouring through soft ground. Machine guns chattered in staccato bursts, close enough to be alarming but not close enough to be immediate. Once, a shell passed overhead with the tearing cloth sound that meant it was travelling away from them, and the men pressed themselves deeper into the hay without thinking, their bodies reacting before their minds could process the information. The radio operator in the team, if there was one, records are unclear, faced his own particular challenge. The sounds of communication could betray a position as surely as movement. One veteran of the division recalled that he had to lie on his radio to deaden its sound, pressing the speaker into his chest and covering the unit with his body to muffle any noise that might carry. Static, a voice from headquarters, the click of a transmission, any of these could be heard by German ears in the unnatural silence of the bocage. Better to lie in darkness, to maintain radio silence, to trust that the fight would unfold as planned or improvise if it didn't. Hours passed. The fog began to lift as the August sun climbed higher, burning away the moisture that clung to the hedgerows. The world came back into focus slowly, revealing the lane in segments. First the near ground, then the middle distance, then the far bend where the lane curved out of sight. The visibility that the team had calculated for returned. That 50-yard window in which they could see and fire and perhaps survive. And then, somewhere beyond the bend, they heard the tanks. The sound came before the sight. Engines first. The rumble of Maybach HL 120 TRMs, pushing 300 horsepower through transmissions never designed for this kind of terrain. Then tracks, the distinctive clatter of steel links grinding against drive sprockets, punctuated by the squeal of metal on metal where lubrication had worn thin. The sound built slowly, growing louder as the source approached, bouncing off the hedgerow walls in ways that made direction hard to judge. But there was no mistaking what it was. Tanks, coming this way, coming toward the bend. The men in the haystack made their final preparations. The loader checked the round one last time, ensuring that the rocket was seated properly in the tube, that the electrical connection was secure, that nothing would prevent ignition when the trigger was pulled. The gunner settled into his firing position, finding the grip that felt right, aligning his eye with the rear aperture, centering the front blade on the space where the tank would appear. There was no more planning now. There was only waiting for the geometry to align. The German perspective in those final minutes before the ambush remains partially obscured by the gaps in the historical record. The specific interrogation reports that might have documented what the crews knew and thought and feared, if such reports exist, have not surfaced in accessible archives. What can be reconstructed comes from the broader context of German armoured operations during Operation Lüttich, and from the patterns of behaviour that surviving documents reveal. The two Panzer IVs approaching the bend were part of the larger effort to break through to Avranches. Their division had received its orders through the chain of command that descended from Hitler himself, through Klug, through von Funk and the XLV Panzer Corps, down to the company and platoon level where men translated strategic imperatives into tactical movements. The pressure to advance was immense. The entire German position in Normandy depended on reaching Avranches, on cutting the thin corridor through which American supplies flowed to Patton's armies, racing toward Paris. Every hour of delay meant more American reinforcements, more fighter bombers returning to the skies, more of the careful German plans unravelling. This pressure translated into speed. Tank commanders who might have preferred to move cautiously, to send infantry ahead to scout, to wait for better visibility, instead pushed forward because their orders demanded forward movement. The calculus was brutal. Lose tanks to ambush, or lose the war through delay. The commanders chose to risk the ambush. They had been risking ambush since the offensive began. Some of them had already survived close calls, rounds that missed, bazookas that failed to fire, anti-tank guns that gave away their positions before they could get off a killing shot. Each survival reinforced the gambler's conviction that luck would hold a little longer. The lead tank came around the bend first. Its commander was buttoned up, hatches closed against the sniper threat that haunted every bocage movement. He could see the lane ahead through his vision slits, 8 slits arranged around the cupola, each one showing a narrow slice of the world outside. The slits were designed for observation on open battlefields, where a commander could build a composite picture by scanning from one to the next. In the bocage, they showed only hedgerow walls and overhanging branches, a green tunnel that could hide anything. The driver had an even more restricted view. His vision port showed the lane directly ahead, a narrow rectangle of muddy track and encroaching vegetation. He could see where to steer, but not what lay beyond the next bend. He was navigating by feel as much as by sight, reading the lane through the steering controls, sensing the camber and the surface texture through the tank's suspension. When the bend came, he slowed automatically, not from any sense of danger, but because the curve required it. The tank could not take the turn at speed. Physics dictated a walking pace, a careful threading of 30 tons of steel through a passage barely wide enough to accommodate it. The second tank followed at what doctrine prescribed as the correct interval. In open terrain, that interval would have been 100 meters or more, enough space to prevent a single artillery round from disabling both vehicles, enough distance to allow the trailing tank to support the leader if trouble developed. But in the bocage, intervals collapsed. 100 meters of separation meant losing sight of the lead tank entirely, meant navigating blind, meant risking separation that could leave each vehicle isolated and vulnerable. So the interval shrank to 20 or 30 meters, close enough to maintain visual contact, close enough that the second tank's commander could see the back of the first and follow its path exactly. This interval would prove fatal. When the first tank entered the kill zone, the second would be committed to following. There would be no time to reverse, no room to turn, no option except to push forward into the same trap that was about to close on the leader. The doctrine that kept the tanks together for mutual support would keep them together for mutual destruction. The men in both tanks were tired. They had been fighting since before dawn, advancing through terrain that punished every movement, taking fire from positions they could never quite see. The stress of operating in the bocage accumulated in ways that did not show on any readiness report. Nerves frayed, reactions slowed. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive in the early hours of the offensive began to dull into something more dangerous. A fatalism that whispered that what would happen, that no amount of caution could prevent the round that had your name on it. The lead tank's commander was focused on the bend. He was looking ahead, trying to see what lay beyond the curve, trying to spot any threat before it could become lethal. He was not looking at the haystack. He had no reason to look at the haystack. It was a haystack, part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the hedgerows themselves. His training had not prepared him to see haystacks as threats. His experience had taught him to watch for muzzle flashes and anti-tank gun positions and bazooka teams hiding in ditches. But a haystack was just a haystack. It was agriculture. It was France. It was nothing. This was the blindness that the bocage created. Not physical blindness. The commander could see perfectly well through his slits, but conceptual blindness. An inability to perceive threats that did not fit expected patterns. The Americans hiding in that haystack were exploiting a gap in perception as surely as they were exploiting a gap in armour. They were invisible because they were impossible, because no German tactical manual had ever warned that the enemy might hide in haystacks and use manure carts as range markers. They were invisible because they had become part of the landscape, and the landscape was supposed to be neutral. The first tank reached the apex of the bend. Its gun pointed forward, following the curve of the lane, unable to traverse because the hedgerow walls pressed too close on either side. The commander's attention was fixed on the ground ahead, on the lane opening up beyond the turn, on the space where the next threat might appear. He did not see the shadow that moved slightly in the haystack to his right. He did not see the tube that rose into firing position, tracking his tank's movement with careful precision. He did not see the gunner's eye aligning with the sights, centering on the flat expanse of side armour that was now finally in range. The manure cart passed beneath his field of vision. The loader in the haystack tapped the gunner's shoulder. The geometry was complete. What happened next took 11 seconds. The rocket leaves the tube with a sound that splits the morning, a sharp crack followed by a rushing hiss, the propellant charge hurling the projectile across 32 yards of Norman air in a fraction of a heartbeat. The distance is nothing. At this range, the shaped charge might as well be pressed directly against the armour. The gunner does not see the rocket fly. No one does. The eye cannot track something moving at nearly 300 feet per second across a space that could be crossed in a few running strides. There is only the firing, and then the impact, and the time between them is too brief to register as time at all. The rocket strikes the Panzer IV just aft of the turret ring, on the flat vertical plate that protects the fighting compartment. 30 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armour. At this angle, at this range, the armour might as well be paper. The shaped charge is a precisely engineered instrument of destruction, a copper cone backed by explosive that has been designed for exactly this moment, for exactly this geometry. When the fuse makes contact with the steel, the explosive detonates and physics takes over. The detonation does not punch through the armour in the way that a solid shot would. It does something stranger, something that the designers in American laboratories had spent years perfecting. The explosive force collapses the copper cone at the heart of the warhead, transforming it in microseconds from a hollow shape into a superplastic jet of metal moving at nearly 20,000 feet per second. This jet is narrow, perhaps the width of a pencil, but it carries enormous energy concentrated into an impossibly small point. It does not so much penetrate the armour as ignore it, passing through the steel as though the steel were not there. Inside the tank, in the fighting compartment where the gunner and loader and commander work, the jet arrives before the sound of the impact. The crew does not hear the rocket hit, they feel it. The jet punches through the armour and continues into the space where men are sitting, where ammunition is stored, where the mechanical systems that keep the tank alive are housed, and as it passes through, it carries with it a spray of molten copper and steel fragments torn from the inner face of the armour plate, spool, the tankers call it, a word that sounds almost gentle for something so catastrophic. The spool fans out in a cone behind the penetration point. Fragments of metal, some as small as grains of sand, some as large as a man's thumb, scatter through the compartment at velocities that make them lethal against unarmoured flesh. The jet itself continues until it expends its energy, boring through whatever lies in its path, equipment, bodies, the far wall of the hull. The crew has no time to react because there is no time. The interval between the rocket leaving the tube and the jet entering the compartment is less than a third of a second. The interval between the jet's entry and its passage through the space is measured in thousandths of a second. A man cannot form a thought in that time. He cannot begin to flinch, cannot start to raise a hand, cannot even consciously register that something is wrong before the wrongness has already happened. The loader takes the worst of it. He is positioned nearest to the point of impact, standing in the space between the gun breech and the turret ring, reaching for the next round in the ready rack. The jet passes close enough to him that its passage alone is enough to kill, the superheated copper and the fragments it drags behind it tearing through his body before he can know that anything has happened. He dies without pain, without fear, without any of the suffering that war usually demands as its price. This is the strange mercy of shaped charges. They kill too fast for the nervous system to process. One moment the loader is a man performing his duty, reaching for ammunition, thinking whatever thoughts occupy a soldier's mind in combat. The next moment, he is not. The gunner is seated lower, to the left of the gun breech, his face pressed to the optics that let him aim the long 75. The jet does not strike him directly, but the spool does. A fragment the size of a coin catches him in the side of the head, just above the ear, where his padded headset offers no protection. The impact spins him sideways in his seat. He is not killed instantly. He will live for another few seconds, long enough for his body to register the catastrophic damage, long enough for his hands to rise reflexively toward the wound, long enough for some last fragment of consciousness to understand that something terrible has occurred. But he is dying from the moment the fragment hits. Nothing can change that now. The commander is standing in the turret, his head just below the closed hatch, his eyes at the vision slits. The penetration point is behind and below him. The jet does not reach him. The spool does not reach him. For a fraction of a second he is unharmed, untouched by the violence that has just torn through his tank. But the shaped charge has done more than kill two of his crew. It has done what it was designed to do. It has breached the armour, and in breaching the armour, it has created a pathway for something far more dangerous. The rocket's explosive charge generates enormous heat at the moment of detonation. Some of this heat travels with the jet, superheating the copper and the spool it carries. Some of it radiates outward from the penetration point, turning the armour around the hole into a ring of glowing metal, and some of it finds the ammunition. The Panzer IV carries its main gun rounds in racks distributed around the fighting compartment, along the walls, beneath the turret floor, wherever space permits. The designers knew that ammunition storage was the tank's greatest vulnerability. They tried to protect the rounds with armour and spacing and careful placement. But in the cramped confines of the bocage tank, with ammunition positioned for rapid access rather than maximum safety, the protection is not enough. The propellant in a tank round is not like the explosive in a bomb. It does not detonate, it burns. But it burns with terrifying speed and intensity, a controlled fury that is meant to hurl a shell down the barrel at thousands of feet per second. When that propellant ignites outside the controlled environment of the gun breech, when it catches fire because a jet of superheated copper has passed too close, the fury becomes uncontrolled. The propellant charge in a single 75mm round burns hot enough to melt steel. When multiple charges ignite simultaneously, the effect is not an explosion in the conventional sense. It is something closer to a furnace, an instantaneous conversion of solid propellant into expanding gas and searing heat that fills every space in the compartment and seeks any exit it can find. The commander feels this before he sees it. A wall of heat rising from below, a pressure wave that slams into his legs and back, a brightness that turns the interior of the turret from shadow into blinding white. He does not know what has happened. He cannot know. The sequence of events, rocket impact, jet penetration, spall dispersal, propellant ignition, has taken place in less time than it takes to blink. All he knows is that his tank is dying around him, and that the heat is rising and that he must get out or die with it. His hands find the hatch handle. Training takes over. A tanker learns to evacuate in darkness, in smoke, in the disorientation of combat. The movements are automatic. Rotate the handle, push upward, lift the hatch against whatever weight might be pressing down on it. The commander's muscles perform these actions without conscious direction, without thought, because there is no time for thought. The hatch swings open. Daylight pours in. He hauls himself upward, through the opening, into the air above the turret. His legs are burning. His uniform is smouldering. He does not feel the pain yet. Shock and adrenaline have suspended his body's normal responses, but the damage is being done. He rolls off the turret and falls to the ground beside the tank, landing in the dirt of the sunken lane, landing in the world outside the steel coffin that was supposed to protect him. Behind him, inside the tank, the fire spreads. The propellant charges in the ready rack are cooking off now, round after round, catching and burning, each one adding its heat to the inferno. The driver and radio operator in the front hull are separated from the fighting compartment by a steel bulkhead, but the bulkhead has gaps where cables and speaking tubes pass through, and the fire finds these gaps. Flames lick into the driver's compartment. Smoke fills the space. The driver is fighting with his hatch, trying to open it against the pressure of the heat, trying to escape before the fire reaches him. The radio operator is doing the same, his hands clawing at the hull escape hatch, his lungs filling with smoke that tastes of burning oil and burning metal and burning things he does not want to identify. 2 seconds have passed since the rocket hit. In the haystack, the bazooka team is already moving. The loader has ejected the spent rocket's tail fin from the rear of the tube and is reaching for the second round. The gunner has not taken his eye from the target. He has shifted his aim, tracking from the first tank to the second, from the vehicle that is already dying to the vehicle that does not yet know it is about to die. His movements are smooth and practiced. A trained bazooka crew can reload in roughly 5 seconds under combat conditions. The stress of actual fire, the need to maintain cover, the physical awkwardness of the position, all of these factors slow the process. But the team has drilled this sequence 100 times. They have practiced until the actions became automatic, until muscle memory could take over when conscious thought failed. The loader's hands know what to do. They do it. The second Panzer IV is 20 meters behind the first. Its commander has seen the flash. He has seen the smoke beginning to rise from the lead tank's hull. He has heard, or perhaps only felt, the concussion of the impact. For a frozen instant he understands what has happened. His training screams at him to reverse, to back the tank out of the kill zone, to put distance between his vehicle and whatever weapon has just destroyed his comrade. But his eyes have also seen where the shot came from. The haystack. He has seen the tube rising from the hay, has seen the flash of the rocket igniting, has seen the direction of the attack, and his training also tells him that the shooter is vulnerable now, exposed and reloading, a soft target that his hull machine gun could tear apart in seconds. He's caught between 2 imperatives. The sunken lane offers no room to turn, No space to bring the main gun to bear on a target to the side. The hedgerow walls press in like the sides of a coffin. If he reverses, he admits defeat. If he advances, he drives into the same trap that has just killed the lead tank. But if he can close the distance, if he can get close enough for the hull gunner to engage, he might eliminate the threat. He might survive. The decision takes less than a second. He orders the driver forward. This is the choice that will kill him. He does not know it yet. He believes he is being aggressive, decisive, that he is taking the fight to the enemy rather than fleeing from it. He believes that speed and violence will carry him through the ambush, that a tank is still a tank even in the bocage, that the armour that has protected him through 100 kilometres of combat will protect him for another 50 metres. He is wrong, but he cannot know that he is wrong, and so he makes the choice that seems right in the fraction of a second available to him. The tank lurches forward, the engine roars, the tracks bite into the dirt of the lane, and the Panzer IV accelerates past the burning wreck of its partner, past the man rolling in the dirt with his legs on fire, past the smoke and the flames and the acrid stench of burning propellant. The commander is screaming into his intercom, ordering the hull gunner to fire, ordering suppression on the haystack, ordering the destruction of the team that has just killed half his platoon. The hull gunner responds. His finger finds the trigger. The bow machine gun begins to chatter, pouring rounds into the hay, tearing the stack apart in a spray of straw and debris. But the bazooka team is no longer there. They have moved. In the seconds between firing the first rocket and the second tank's charge, they have shifted position, sliding sideways along the hedgerow base, keeping the manure cart between themselves and the oncoming fire. The hay absorbs the bullets. The cart absorbs the bullets. The 30 caliber rounds that could tear a man apart at this range find nothing but agricultural debris, nothing but the detritus of a farm that no longer exists. 3 seconds, 4 seconds. The loader slams the second rocket into the tube. The contact is solid, the safety is off, the circuit is live. The gunner settles his sights on the second tank, which is now closer, much closer, closing the distance at a speed that will bring it past the firing position in another 2 seconds. The geometry has changed. The first shot was a flank shot, a clean angle on the vulnerable side armour. This shot will be different. The tank is charging almost directly at them, presenting its frontal armour, its 80 millimeters of sloped steel, armour that a bazooka cannot penetrate. But the gunner is not aiming at the front. He is not trying to defeat the heaviest armour on the vehicle. He is aiming lower, at the junction between the hull and the tracks, at the running gear and the drive sprocket, at the mechanical systems that keep the tank moving. A bazooka cannot kill a Panzer IV from the front, but it can wound it. It can tear off a track. It can jam the sprocket. It can turn a mobile weapon into a stationary target, and a stationary target in the bocage is a dead target. 5 seconds, the gunner fires. The second rocket leaves the tube with the same cracking hiss as the first. It covers the distance in an instant, shorter now because the tank has charged closer, because the gap between hunter and prey has collapsed to perhaps 10 meters. The rocket strikes the left track assembly at the point where the drive sprocket meets the first road wheel. The shaped charge detonates against thinner armour here, against the bolted plates that protect the running gear, against steel that was designed to stop shrapnel, not penetrating warheads. The jet punches through. It severs the track link. It damages the sprocket teeth. It does not kill anyone inside the tank. The running gear is outside the armoured envelope, but it does something almost as effective. The tank throws its track. The left track, severed and mangled, whips off the road wheels and tangles in the wreckage of the running gear. The right track continues to drive. The tank slews violently to the left, grinding into the hedgerow embankment, burying its nose in the dirt and roots and tangled vegetation. The engine screams as the driver tries to compensate, tries to bring the vehicle back under control, but there is nothing to control anymore. The tank is stuck. The tank is dead. The commander knows it. He feels the impact, feels the sudden loss of momentum, feels the vehicle lurch and grind to a halt. The hull gunner is still firing, still pouring rounds into the hedgerow, but the rounds are going wide now, chewing up vegetation to the right of where the bazooka team is positioned. The main gun is useless, still pointed forward, unable to traverse in the narrow confines of the lane. The crew is alive but immobilized, trapped in a steel box that cannot move and cannot fight and cannot escape the men who are surely, even now, preparing another rocket. 6 seconds. 7. The bazooka team does not fire again. They do not need to. The first tank is fully engulfed now. Flames roaring from every hatch. ammunition cooking off in a continuous ripple of explosions that sends shells tumbling out of the wreck in random directions. The driver and radio operator have made it out, barely, dragging themselves through their hatches with burns and smoke inhalation that will put them in a field hospital for weeks. The commander is lying in the lane, his legs charred black below the knee, conscious but unable to move. The loader and gunner are still inside, they will not be coming out. The second tank is stuck, its crew frantically trying to reverse, trying to rock the vehicle free, trying to do anything that might restore mobility. But the track is gone. The sprocket is mangled. The tank is not going anywhere, and the crew knows what comes next. They know that infantry will be coming, that the bazooka team is not alone, that the hedgerows around them are full of American soldiers who have been waiting for exactly this moment. They know that their armour, which was supposed to protect them, has become their prison. 8 seconds. 9. The commander of the second tank makes the only decision left to him. He orders the crew to bail out. Surrender is better than burning. Capture is better than death. The hatches swing open. Men begin to emerge, hands raised, voices calling out words that might be surrender, or might be please, or might simply be the sounds that men make when the war stops being abstract and becomes personal. 10 seconds. The bazooka team is already withdrawing. They have done what they came to do. 2 tanks destroyed, 1 burning, 1 immobilized. They do not stay to count prisoners. They do not stay to confirm kills. They slip back through the hedgerow, through the gap they identified hours earlier, through the escape route they planned before the first tank ever appeared. They're gone before the German crew members have finished climbing out of their hatches. They're gone before the smoke has finished rising from the first tank. They're gone before anyone on the German side can identify where the shots came from or who fired them. 11 seconds. The engagement is over. In the lane, the wreckage smoulders. The surviving crew members gather in the dirt, some wounded, some merely dazed, all of them struggling to comprehend what has just happened. A few minutes ago, they were part of an armoured spearhead, part of Operation Lüttich, part of Hitler's last gamble to turn the tide in Normandy. Now they're standing in a sunken road beside 2 burning tanks, prisoners of an enemy they never saw, victims of a weapon they were trained to despise. The bazooka was a joke. Everyone knew the bazooka was a joke. It couldn't penetrate frontal armour. It couldn't stop a tank at any reasonable range. It was a desperation weapon, something the Americans gave to their infantry because they didn't have anything better. And yet here they stand, among the burning wreckage of 2 Panzer IVs, destroyed by exactly that weapon, wielded by exactly those men. The fire in the first tank reaches something deep in the hull, fuel perhaps, or remaining ammunition that had not yet cooked off. And the vehicle ruptures, a secondary explosion that lifts the turret slightly and then drops it back in a cascade of sparks and debris. The sound echoes down the lane, a final punctuation mark on an engagement that lasted less time than it takes to draw a deep breath. The sunken road that swallowed light has now swallowed 2 more tanks, 2 more crews, 2 more pieces of the German war machine. The survivors will be collected by American infantry within the hour. They will be searched, disarmed, separated from their wounded, processed through the field interrogation system that the Allies have perfected over years of war. They will answer questions about their unit, their orders, their equipment, their morale. They will describe what they saw and what they felt and what they understood to have happened in those 11 seconds. And their testimony, filtered through translators and typed onto carbon paper and filed in folders that will eventually find their way to archives, will become part of the historical record of the battle. But that comes later. For now, there is only the burning tank and the immobilized tank, and the smoke rising into the Norman sky. There is only the silence that follows violence, the strange stillness that settles over a battlefield when the shooting stops. There is only the evidence: 2 destroyed Panzers, a scattered haystack, an overturned manure cart, and somewhere in the hedgerows, already moving toward their next position, a bazooka team that has just proven that the desperation weapon works. The barrage continues, the lane continues, the war continues. But for 2 German tank crews, the war has ended here, in a sunken road that they could not see clearly, against an enemy they could not see at all, in 11 seconds that will follow the survivors for the rest of their lives. The second tank's commander had perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds between the moment the lead Panzer IV erupted in flame and the moment his own vehicle shuddered to a halt, Track severed. War over. 4 seconds to process the catastrophe ahead, to issue orders, to save his crew. 4 seconds that would stretch across interrogation transcripts and memory alike, expanding and contracting depending on who told the story and when. Inside the turret, the sequence began with light. The commander, buttoned up in his cupola, vision limited to the 8 narrow slits that ringed his position, registered the flash before he understood its meaning. One moment the lane ahead showed the familiar silhouette of the lead tank, its bulk filling the passage, its commander's cupola just visible above the hedgerow line. The next moment there was brilliance, a white-orange flare that saturated every vision block simultaneously, followed by a pressure wave that he felt through the steel walls of his own vehicle. The human mind does not process catastrophe in real time, it lags. The commander's first coherent thought, according to the statement he would give American interrogators within 48 hours, was that the lead tank had struck a mine. This was wrong, but it was the closest analogue his training offered. Mines were a known hazard. Mines explained sudden explosions. Mines did not require him to accept that the Americans had placed men with shoulder-fired weapons in haystacks along sunken lanes, waiting with the patience of a hunter's for tanks to pass within spitting distance. By the time he understood it was not a mine, by the time the secondary ammunition cook-off in the lead tank illuminated the entire lane in pulsing orange light, 1.5 seconds had passed. He shouted for reverse. The driver, 19 years old, positioned in the forward left hull behind his own vision slits, could see almost nothing. The lane ahead was obscured by the burning wreck of the lead tank. The hedgerow walls rose on either side, earthen banks topped with vegetation that pressed against the hull like the walls of a grave. The driver had been trained on the Eastern Front, where tank battles meant sweeping fields and engagement ranges measured in hundreds of meters. Nothing in that training prepared him for this. Nothing explained what to do when your tank was trapped in a passage barely wider than the vehicle itself, with fire ahead, an unknown threat on all sides. He threw the transmission into reverse. The Maybach engine, already running at high idle, responded instantly, 300 horsepower surging backward through the drive sprockets. But the Panzer IV was not designed for rapid, rearward movement in confined spaces. The driver could not see behind him. The commander, still processing the destruction of the lead tank, had not yet checked the rear vision blocks. Neither man knew what lay in the darkness behind them. The tank lurched backward, perhaps 2 meters before the commander countermanded the order. This decision would haunt the interrogation transcripts. Why stop? Why not continue reversing until the vehicle cleared the lane? The commander's explanation, delivered through an American translator in a tent that smelled of canvas and cigarette smoke, was that he believed German infantry were following somewhere behind them. To reverse blindly was to risk crushing his own supporting troops. To reverse blindly was to flee from an enemy he had not yet identified. To reverse blindly was to abandon the crew of the lead tank, some of whom might still be alive. None of these considerations were wrong exactly, but none of them accounted for the bazooka team that was already displacing through the hedgerow gap, already reloading, already acquiring the second tank in their sights. 2.5 seconds. The commander ordered the turret to traverse. If they were under attack from the hedgerow, if there were American infantry in the vegetation, the tank's primary weapon could suppress them. The 7.5 cm SS-40 could put high explosive rounds into the brush, could shred whatever concealment the enemy had found, could buy time for the crew to assess the situation and respond. The gunner, hands on the traverse wheel, began to rotate the turret clockwise. The commander had seen, or thought he had seen, movement on the right side of the lane, somewhere in the tangle of vegetation that crowned the earthen bank. If the enemy was there, the gun could reach them. If the enemy was there, German firepower would still prevail. But the turret did not complete its rotation. The lane was 12 feet wide. The Panzer IV's turret, when fully traversed, extended beyond the hull width. As the gun swung right, the barrel struck the earthen wall of the sunken road. Not a collision, exactly, but a scraping contact that arrested the movement. The gunner pushed harder on the traverse. The mechanism groaned. The barrel dug into centuries-old Norman soil, compacted by rain and root systems into something approaching concrete. The turret stopped at roughly 40 degrees from centerline. The gun pointed into the hedgerow embankment, muzzle buried in vegetation and dirt. It could not fire. It could not traverse further. The tank's primary weapon was, for all practical purposes, disabled. 3 seconds. The commander understood the geometry now. He understood that they were trapped in a lane too narrow for effective turret traverse, too confined for rapid maneuver, too obscured for clear observation. He understood that whatever had destroyed the lead tank was still out there, still capable of striking again. He understood that the doctrine he had learned, the tactics that had crushed Soviet armour from Poland to Kursk, meant nothing here. He began to shout orders that no longer cohered into tactical sense. Open hatches, dismount, return fire with personal weapons. The loader, positioned in the turret basket beside the useless gun, reached for the MP-40 submachine gun stowed in its hull bracket. The radio operator in the forward right hull was already transmitting a contact report that would never be acknowledged. The tank's antenna had been damaged during the earlier advance through bokage, reception intermittent at best. The driver, still in gear, still awaiting coherent instructions, felt the vehicle shudder. The second bazooka round struck the junction between the drive sprocket and the first road wheel, a shot that demonstrated either extraordinary marksmanship or extraordinary luck, depending on which account you credit. The shaped charge jet did not need to penetrate heavy armour here. The running gear was exposed, vulnerable, maintained under constant stress by the weight of a 30-ton vehicle moving over uneven ground. The warhead severed the track as cleanly as a blade through rope. The Panzer IV lurched sideways, its left track suddenly loose, suddenly dragging, suddenly useless. The driver, who had been holding the vehicle in gear, felt the transmission scream as the drive sprocket spun freely against nothing. The tank slewed left, its nose swinging toward the hedgerow wall, its wounded side exposed to the lane behind. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. The commander, thrown against his cupola ring by the impact, made his final tactical decision of the engagement. He ordered the crew to abandon the vehicle. This was not cowardice. This was not panic, though panic was certainly present. This was recognition that the tank had become a coffin. The turret could not traverse, the gun could not fire, the vehicle could not move. They were stationary targets in a narrow lane with a burning tank ahead and an unseen enemy somewhere in the vegetation. Every second they remained inside was a second that enemy could reload, re-em, and fire again. The loader went first, up through the turret hatch, into smoke and uncertain air. The commander followed, levering himself out of the cupola with burns on his palms from metal heated by nearby fire. The gunner came next, moving slowly. He had struck his head on the gun breech during the impact and would later report that the next several minutes existed only in fragments, disconnected images without narrative coherence. The driver and radio operator exited through their forward hatches, pulling themselves up and over the hull, dropping into the sunken lane on the side away from the burning lead tank. They expected fire. They expected the Americans to cut them down as they emerged. They expected the hedgerows to erupt with rifle shots, with the distinctive crack of M1 Garands, with the violence that had been visited upon their vehicles. Instead, they found silence. The bazooka team was already gone. The withdrawal route ran northwest through a gap in the hedgerow that the team had identified during their pre-dawn reconnaissance, a section where the earthen bank had partially collapsed, perhaps due to erosion, perhaps due to a farmer's modification years or decades earlier. The gap was perhaps 4 feet wide, barely visible from the lane, invisible from any point more than 20 yards distant. It was the kind of feature that existed throughout the bocage, the kind of detail that became life or death depending on whether you knew about it. The loader went through first, bazooka tube across his shoulders, moving at a pace that was not quite running. Running made noise. Running caught the eye. Running suggested prey, and prey attracted pursuit. He moved instead in a low crouch, feet finding ground before committing weight, hands free to catch himself if he stumbled. The techniques were not his own invention. They were the product of weeks in the hedgerow country, learned from men who had been doing this since June, passed down from squad to squad in the oral tradition of infantry warfare. Behind him, the gunner followed with the ammunition bag, lighter now, 2 rockets expended, the weight that remained merely uncomfortable rather than crushing. He did not look back at the lane. He did not confirm that the second tank was immobilized. He did not count prisoners or assess damage. Those were tasks for men who had time, and time was a luxury that evaporated the moment the second rocket left the tube. The gap opened into a field, stubbled wheat, harvested earlier in the summer, the stalks cut to ankle height and left to dry in rows that had once been neat but were now disrupted by shell craters and vehicle tracks. The field offered no concealment, but it offered distance. Distance was safety. Distance was the transformation from combatants to ghosts, from targets to rumours, from men who had just destroyed 2 tanks to men who had never been there at all. They crossed the field at the same controlled pace, angling toward a tree line that marked the boundary of the next hedgerow complex. The morning sun was fully up now, the fog burned away, visibility extended to hundreds of yards. Anyone watching from the German positions would have seen them. 2 figures moving through the stubble, carrying equipment that was unmistakably military, heading unmistakably away from the sound of the explosion. But no one was watching. The German attention was fixed on the lane, on the burning tanks, on the incomprehensible disaster that had befallen the armoured spearhead. The tree line swallowed them. More hedgerows, more sunken lanes, more of the terrain that had dominated their existence for weeks. But these lanes were familiar. These hedgerows were mapped. The loader knew that if he continued northwest for another 300 yards, he would reach a farm road that led to the company command post. The gunner knew that the battalion anti-tank officer was somewhere in that direction, waiting for reports from the teams he had positioned throughout the sector. They had rehearsed this extraction. They had walked the route twice before dawn, memorizing landmarks, identifying alternates in case the primary path was compromised. The planning had seemed excessive at the time. How much preparation did you need to walk away from a fight? But now, moving through the hedgerows with the sound of secondary explosions still audible behind them, the planning revealed its value. They did not have to think. They did not have to make decisions. They simply moved along a path that had been laid down hours earlier, their minds freed to process what they had just done. The loader would later describe this phase of the operation as the strangest part. Stranger than the waiting, stranger than the shooting, stranger than the sight of a tank erupting in fire 30 yards away. The strangeness was in the normalcy. He was walking through a French field on a summer morning. Birds were singing somewhere in the hedgerows, not many, but some, returning after the violence had passed. The wheat stubble crackled under his boots. The bazooka tube was warm against his shoulder, residual heat from firing. Everything was ordinary, except that he had just killed at least 1 man and probably more, and he could not stop his hands from shaking. The gunner did not speak. The 2 men had worked together for 3 weeks, since the gunner's original partner had been evacuated with shrapnel wounds from a mortar barrage. They had developed the wordless communication of men who depended on each other for survival. Glances that conveyed tactical information, gestures that replaced orders, a shared understanding that transcended the need for language. Now they moved in that same silence, each processing the engagement in his own way, each carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the equipment on their backs. They reached the farm road 11 minutes after leaving the lane. The timing was reconstructed later, from reports and maps and the testimony of the battalion anti-tank officer who received them at the command post. 11 minutes to cover 300 yards of contested terrain, moving carefully, checking corners, treating every hedgerow gap as a potential ambush site. 11 minutes that felt like hours and also like seconds, time distorted by adrenaline and aftermath. The command post was a stone farmhouse, its roof partially collapsed from earlier fighting, its walls pocked with bullet scars and blackened by smoke. The battalion had taken it 2 days earlier, clearing German holdouts room by room, and had converted the surviving structure into a forward headquarters. Radio antennas sprouted from the rubble. Officers moved in and out through a door that had been reinforced with sandbags. The entire scene had the improvised permanence of military operations in the field. Built to last for days, not years, already showing signs of wear. The anti-tank officer was a first lieutenant from Ohio, 24 years old, West Point class of 1943. He had been in Normandy since June 15th, and had already lost 2 complete bazooka teams to German fire. One to a tank shell that found their position before they could shoot, one to infantry that flanked them during a withdrawal. He had learned to manage expectations, to plan for losses, to celebrate survival as much as success. He saw the bazooka team approaching across the farmyard and knew from their posture that they had engaged. There was something in the way men walked after combat, a looseness in the shoulders, a heaviness in the step, an attention to the middle distance that suggested minds processing experience rather than scanning for threat. He had seen it in himself, reflected in the reactions of others. He recognized it now in the loader's gait, in the gunner's slightly unfocused gaze. The report was brief. Contact with 2 Panzer IVs in the lane. First tank destroyed with a flank shot. Second tank immobilized with a mobility kill. Both crews survived in unknown numbers. No American casualties. Withdrawal along primary route without contact. 11 seconds from first shot to last. The lieutenant wrote the details in a small notebook that he carried in his breast pocket. The same notebook where he recorded casualties, ammunition expenditures, positions and repositionings. The bazooka team's engagement would eventually be typed onto a form, incorporated into an after-action report, forwarded up the chain of command to division and beyond. It would become one data point among thousands, one small victory in a battle that was still being fought, one proof that the desperation weapon could work when employed with skill and patience and luck. But that bureaucratic immortality came later. In the moment, the lieutenant simply nodded, told the team to get food and rest, and returned to the radios that crackled with reports from a dozen other positions. The war continued, the bocage continued. 2 tanks were burning in a sunken lane, and somewhere in the German rear, commanders were trying to understand what had gone wrong with their armoured spearhead, and none of it could be solved by celebrating a single successful ambush. The loader and gunner found a corner of the farmhouse that was relatively intact. Stone walls, partial roof, enough shelter to feel like respite. They ate cold rations from their packs, drank water from canteens that had been filled before dawn, sat in silence as the morning aged toward noon. Around them the command post hummed with activity. Reports came in. Orders went out. The battle for Mortain continued in all its complexity, beyond the scope of any single engagement, beyond the understanding of any single participant. The shaking in the loader's hands did not stop for almost an hour. The interrogation of the German tank crews began within 6 hours of their capture. The American system for processing prisoners of war had evolved considerably since the early days of the North African campaign. By August 1944, the process was standardized, efficient, and remarkably thorough. Prisoners were collected at company level, moved to battalion collection points, then transported to division cages where specialized interrogators, often men with German language training or German immigrant backgrounds, extracted tactical and strategic intelligence before the prisoners were shipped further to the rear. The survivors of the 2 Panzer IVs in the sunken lane entered this system through the 30th Division's forward collection point, a fenced area adjacent to a field hospital where the walking wounded could be processed alongside the merely captured. The location was not coincidental. Wounded prisoners were often more willing to talk, their resistance softened by pain and the gratitude that accompanied medical treatment from captors who were not obligated to provide it. Of the 10 men who had crewed the 2 tanks, 7 survived to reach the collection point. The loader from the first tank was dead, killed instantly by the shaped charge jet that penetrated the turret. The gunner from the first tank had died of his wounds during the walk to American lines, internal injuries too severe for field treatment. The driver of the first tank had burns on both hands and forearms, blisters that would eventually require evacuation to England. But he could walk and talk and answer questions. The second tank's crew had fared better, if better was a term that could be applied to men who had just lost their vehicle, their mission, and their war. The commander had burns on his palms and a gash on his forehead from striking his cupola ring. The gunner had a concussion that left him intermittently confused for the next several days. The loader, driver, and radio operator were physically unharmed, though all 3 exhibited the tremors and 1,000-yard stares that American medics had learned to recognize as the immediate aftermath of combat trauma. The interrogators worked in pairs. One asked questions in German, or occasionally in the Alsatian dialect that some of the immigrant interrogators still remembered from childhood. The other recorded responses, noting not just what was said, but how it was said, hesitations, contradictions, emotional reactions that might indicate deception or suppression. The technique was not designed to extract secrets under duress. It was designed to harvest information efficiently, building a mosaic from hundreds of small testimonies that would eventually reveal the shape of German operations in ways that no single prisoner could comprehend. The first question was always the same: name, rank, unit, date of birth. The Geneva Convention required prisoners to provide this information, and most did so without resistance. The prisoners from the sunken lane were no exception. They identified themselves as members of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, a designation that caused the interrogators to exchange glances across the tent. Das Reich had a reputation. Its members had been implicated in atrocities on the Eastern Front, in mass executions in France, in a catalogue of war crimes that was only partially understood in August 1944 but would become a matter of historical record in the years that followed. The interrogators did not mention this reputation. They did not allow their knowledge to colour their questions. They simply recorded the unit designation and moved on to tactical matters. How many tanks in the column? What was the objective? Where were the supporting infantry? What was the condition of fuel and ammunition? The questions were mundane, bureaucratic, designed to build understanding rather than assign blame. But eventually, inevitably, the questions turned to the ambush itself. What happened in the lane? The commander of the 2nd tank provided the most coherent account. His statement, typed onto carbon paper and filed in a folder that would eventually make its way to the National Archives, ran to 3 single-spaced pages. He described the approach to the lane, the orders to advance, the difficult terrain, the reduced visibility that made every hedgerow corner a potential threat. He described seeing the lead tank, watching it round the bend in the lane, seeing it disappear from view as his own vehicle followed. He described the flash, the sound, the disbelief. "I thought it was a mine," his statement read. "We had been warned about mines. The Americans used them everywhere. I could not believe it was infantry. Infantry cannot destroy tanks. This is what we were taught. Infantry hides from tanks. Infantry runs from tanks. Infantry dies when tanks find them." He described the 4 seconds, the attempted reversal, the countermanded order. The turret traverse that was blocked by the walls of the lane. He described the impact of the 2nd rocket, the slew of the tank, the realization that they were immobilized. He described ordering his crew to abandon the vehicle. "I expected to be shot when we came out," his statement continued. "I expected the Americans to be waiting for us. Every man had his hands in the air. We were ready to die. But there was no one. Only the burning tank and the smoke. I did not understand. Where were the Americans who did this? How could they disappear?" The driver of the 1st tank provided a different perspective. The view from inside a vehicle that had just been penetrated by a shaped charge warhead. His statement was shorter, more fragmented, interrupted by pauses that the interrogator noted with ellipses and bracketed observations. He remembered seeing something move in the vegetation. A shape, maybe a man, maybe a shadow. Just before the explosion. He remembered heat. He remembered the smell of burning rubber and flesh. He remembered crawling toward his hatch, the metal hot enough to blister his palms, the smoke thick enough to blind him. He remembered emerging into air that was only slightly less toxic than the interior of the tank, collapsing onto the earthen bank of the lane, lying there for what felt like minutes before his surviving crewmates found him. He did not remember seeing the Americans at all. He did not remember the haystack. He did not remember the manure cart. The engagement had happened around him, to him, but not in any sense that allowed for observation or comprehension. He had been inside a steel box when that box became a crematorium, and his survival was a matter of anatomy and luck rather than any action he had taken. The interrogators recorded these testimonies with professional detachment, but the folder eventually accumulated notes and marginalia that revealed their interest in the tactical dimensions of the engagement. Someone, perhaps the battalion anti-tank officer, perhaps a staff officer at division level, added a handwritten annotation. Confirms effectiveness of bazooka ambush from concealed positions at ranges under 50 yards. Flank shots penetrate. Mobility kills viable alternative when flank shots not available. The German accounts were cross-referenced against the report filed by the bazooka team itself. This document was briefer, less introspective, focused on observable facts rather than internal experiences. It noted the position of the haystack, the placement of the manure cart as a range marker, the timing of the approach, the sequence of shots, the withdrawal route, the absence of enemy contact during extraction. It did not speculate about what had happened inside the tanks. It did not attempt to imagine the experience of the German crews. It simply recorded what the Americans had done and observed, leaving the interpretation to others. The two accounts, German and American, did not perfectly align. The Germans believed they had been attacked by multiple positions, by Americans concealed throughout the hedgerows, by a force of unknown size that had targeted them with coordinated precision. This was not true. There had been only 2 men, 1 bazooka, 2 rockets. But the fog of war, the compression of time, the chaos of catastrophe, these had transformed a simple ambush into something that seemed far more elaborate. The Americans, for their part, had not witnessed the interior experience of the tanks. They knew they had scored hits. They knew both vehicles were out of action. They did not know, in any precise way, how many crewmen had died, or how the survivors had experienced those 11 seconds. They had withdrawn before the outcome was fully determined, before the burning tank had completed its consumption, before the immobilized tank's crew had finished evacuating. The truth of the engagement lived in the gap between these accounts, in the space where German terror and American efficiency overlapped, where the experience of killing and the experience of dying failed to correspond. The interrogation system captured fragments of this truth, recorded it on carbon paper, filed it in folders that would survive decades of archival storage and eventual digitization. But no document could fully contain what had happened in that lane. No report could translate 11 seconds of violence into comprehensible narrative. What remained was evidence: 2 destroyed tanks, 7 surviving prisoners, statements that contradicted on details but agreed on essentials. The bazooka worked. The Americans had found a way to fight back against armor. The terrain that had killed so many infantry was also killing tanks, funneling them into ambushes that negated their technological advantages. The war in the Bocage had developed its own logic, its own tactics, its own brutal economy of violence. The prisoners would be evacuated to England, then to camps in the United States, where they would spend the remainder of the war behind wire, contemplating how 11 seconds in a Norman sunken road had transformed them from conquerors into captives. The interrogation reports would be analysed, disseminated, incorporated into training materials that would shape American anti-tank doctrine for the remainder of the European campaign. The bazooka team would return to their positions in the hedgerows, waiting for the next column to advance, the next opportunity to demonstrate that desperation weapons could defeat superior armour when employed with patience and precision. The Bocage continued. The lane continued. Somewhere in the archives of a nation that would not exist for another 45 years, the testimony of men who had faced each other across 30 yards of Norman farmland waited to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, transformed into documentary evidence of a war that consumed millions, but that was fought, in the end, by individuals in small spaces, making decisions in fractions of seconds that would echo across decades. The 11 seconds that unfolded in that sunken lane were not unique. They were not even unusual. What made them significant was not their singularity, but their typicality. They represented one data point among hundreds in a brutal running experiment conducted across the Bocage throughout the summer of 1944. The 30th Infantry Division, holding its sector at Mortain against the full weight of the ex-11th Panzer Corps, was simultaneously fighting a war and learning how to fight it. Every engagement produced information, every destroyed tank yielded lessons, every surviving crew member, American or German, carried knowledge that could be extracted, analysed and disseminated to units that had not yet faced similar circumstances. The problem that the bazooka team had solved in those 11 seconds was the central tactical problem of the Normandy campaign. How does infantry destroy armour when its own anti-tank weapons cannot penetrate frontal plate? The 57mm guns that American forces had brought ashore were designed for a different war, calibrated against armour thicknesses that the German Panzer IV had long since exceeded. At ranges beyond 50 yards, these guns bounced rounds off the 80mm of frontal steel that protected the tank's driver and radio operator. At any angle that did not expose the thinner side or rear armour, the 57mm was essentially useless. A heavy, difficult to manoeuvre piece of equipment that required a crew of 5 to operate, and that could not accomplish its primary mission. This was not a secret. The after-action reports that flowed up through battalion, regiment and division noted the problem with clinical precision. Unit commanders documented the number of rounds expended against Panzer IVs and Panthers, the number of penetrations achieved, the number of tanks destroyed versus the number that withdrew under their own power. The mathematics were damning. The 57mm was failing. Something else was required. The bazooka emerged not because it was an ideal solution, but because it was available. The M101 had been designed as a man-portable anti-tank weapon, light enough for 2 soldiers to carry, simple enough to operate with minimal training. Its shaped charge warhead could penetrate 3.5 to 4 inches of steel, more than sufficient to defeat the 30mm of side armour on a Panzer IV, theoretically capable of penetrating even frontal plate if the angle were favourable and the range short enough. But the weapon had severe limitations that its designers had understood and that combat quickly confirmed. Effective range was 30 to 50 yards against a moving target, perhaps 75 against a stationary one. The rocket's trajectory was affected by wind. The backblast revealed the firer's position. The reload time of 4 to 5 seconds meant that a miss against a moving tank was likely to be fatal for the bazooka team. What the bocage provided was a solution to the range problem. The sunken lanes, the hedgerows, the limited visibility, all of these elements that had cost so many infantry lives also created conditions where bazooka teams could engage armour at distances where the weapon actually worked. A tank moving down a lane 12 feet wide, its turret unable to traverse, its commander's vision limited to 50 yards of green tunnel, was vulnerable in ways that the same tank on open terrain was not. The haystack blind, the manure cart range marker, the patient hours of waiting, these were not innovations of desperation, but rather the practical application of a tactical doctrine that was being developed in real time across the entire bocage front. The 30th Division was not alone in this learning process. Throughout the American sector, units were experimenting with close ambush tactics, sharing techniques through the informal networks that connected combat soldiers more effectively than official channels. A method that worked for one squad in one hedgerow would be adopted by neighbouring squads, transmitted to other platoons, eventually formalised in training memoranda that circulated through division and corps headquarters. The process was organic, driven by necessity, refined by the brutal selection pressure of combat. What did not work got soldiers killed. What did work was repeated, improved, taught to others. The bazooka teams developed protocols that would have seemed like madness in any other tactical environment. They learned to let tanks pass, to resist the instinct to fire at the first opportunity, to wait for the moment when the angle was perfect and the range was minimal. They learned to position themselves where the tank's weapons could not bear, in dead zones created by the geometry of the sunken roads, behind obstacles that blocked the hull gunner's field of fire, at angles where the turret's traverse limits meant the main gun could not track them. They learned that mobility kills were sometimes preferable to catastrophic kills, that a tank with a severed track was just as effectively neutralised as a tank with a penetrated hull, and that the crew of an immobilised vehicle often surrendered without further resistance. These lessons were paid for in blood. For every successful ambush like the one in the lane near Mortain, there were failures. Teams that fired too early and missed. Teams that were detected before they could shoot. Teams that achieved a mobility kill only to be cut down by the tank's hull gunner before they could withdraw. The bocage was not a one-sided killing ground. German tank crews, despite the constraints of the terrain, were professional soldiers operating proven equipment. They developed their own countermeasures, their own tactics for surviving in hedgerow country. They learned to button up, to cover each other's flanks, to call for infantry support when entering suspicious lanes. The evolution of tactics was mutual, each side adapting to the other's adaptations in a deadly spiral of innovation. But the fundamental asymmetry remained. The Americans could afford to lose bazooka teams. They could not afford to lose the bocage. Every Panzer IV or Panther destroyed in a hedgerow ambush was a tank that would not participate in the defence of France, would not contest the breakout from Normandy, would not face American armour on the plains beyond. The exchange rate mattered. 2 men with a bazooka who destroyed a tank crewed by 5 men and worth months of German industrial production. This was a trade the Americans would make every time it was offered. The interrogation reports from the lane near Mortain fed directly into this calculus. When the 7 surviving German crewmen described their experience, the catastrophic penetration of the first tank, the psychological paralysis of the second crew, the chaos that followed the track being severed, they were providing intelligence that would shape American doctrine. The pattern was clear. Close-range flank shots were effective. The terrain could be used to create conditions for such shots. Tank crews, once their vehicle was disabled, were often too shocked to resist. The implications were incorporated into training materials that reached other divisions, other corps, other armies preparing for the push beyond Normandy. Meanwhile, the Americans were solving the mobility problem that had made the bocage so costly for their own armour. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen's hedgerow cutter, a simple device welded from salvaged steel that allowed a Sherman to burst through the earthen embankments rather than climb over them, represented a different kind of tactical innovation. Where the bazooka teams had adapted to the terrain by exploiting its constraints against German armour, Cullen's device allowed American tanks to ignore the terrain entirely, to create their own path through the hedgerows rather than being confined to the predictable routes of the sunken lanes. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had watched a demonstration of the prototype. A hedgerow exploded, and through the gap a Sherman burst, its steel teeth dripping earth, its vulnerable underside never exposed to enemy fire. Bradley understood immediately what he was seeing. Within weeks, nearly 3/4 of the 2nd Armoured Division's M4 Shermans and Stuarts had been modified with similar devices in preparation for Operation Cobra. The breakout that followed would demonstrate that American industrial capacity and tactical flexibility could overcome even the most formidable defensive terrain. But that breakout was still in the future when the bazooka team set their ambush in the lane near Mortain. On August 7, 1944, the tactical situation was far less favourable. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's personally ordered counterattack, had sent the tanks of the XL1st Panzer Corps directly into the 30th Division's sector. The objective was Avranches, the coastal town whose capture would sever the American spearhead and potentially reverse the entire course of the Normandy campaign. The stakes could not have been higher. The German forces, though exhausted and under strength, were committed to an offensive that their Führer believed could change the war. The 30th Division held. In the fields around Mortain, in the sunken lanes, in positions hastily prepared and desperately defended, American infantry fought German armour to a standstill. The 50mm guns that could not penetrate frontal armour were repositioned to cover flanks. The bazookas that required suicidal close range were employed by men willing to close that distance. The Bocage that had killed so many Americans now killed Germans as well, funneling the attack into channels where it could be contested by infantry weapons, negating the mobility and firepower that gave German armour its advantage in open terrain. The battle lasted 6 days. When it ended, the Germans had lost over 120 tanks. They had gained nothing. The counterattack that was supposed to cut off the American advance had instead consumed resources that could not be replaced, had committed forces to an operation that was doomed from its inception by terrain, by logistics, by the fundamental reality that the German military could no longer win a war of attrition against enemies who could afford their losses while Germany could not. The 11 seconds in the lane were part of this larger defeat. 2 tanks, 2 crews, 1 ambush. The numbers were insignificant against the scale of Operation Lüttich, but they were also representative. They showed what happened when German armour entered the Bocage without adequate reconnaissance, without infantry support, without the situational awareness that the terrain made impossible to achieve. They demonstrated that the technological superiority embodied in the Panzer IV could be negated by fieldcraft, by patience, by weapons that cost a fraction of what the tank cost, and that required a fraction of the training to employ effectively. The after-action reports accumulated, the interrogation transcripts were analysed, the lessons were extracted and formalised and transmitted through channels that reached far beyond the 30th Division, far beyond Mortain, eventually far beyond Normandy itself. By the time American forces reached the Rhine, the close ambush doctrine that had been developed in the hedgerows had become standard practice. Infantry knew how to fight tanks. They did not like it. They understood that the exchange rate, favourable in aggregate, was irrelevant to the individual soldier who drew the assignment. But they knew the techniques, had trained on the procedures, carried the weapons that could kill armour when properly employed. The war moved on. The Bocage was left behind, first bypassed by the breakout from Normandy, then relegated to the rear as the front lines advanced across France toward Germany. The sunken lanes that had witnessed so much violence returned to their original purpose, serving the farms that had existed for centuries before the war and that would exist for centuries after. The hedgerows grew back where they had been torn, the shell craters filled with rainwater and then with earth. The burned-out tanks were salvaged for scrap, their steel recycled into the industrial economy that rebuilt Europe in the decades following the war. The lane near Mortain exists today. The embankments still rise on either side, 4 feet below the level of the surrounding fields, worn by centuries of cart traffic into the characteristic profile of the bocage. The hedgerows still top the earthen walls, though they have been trimmed back in places to accommodate modern agricultural equipment. The light filtering through the canopy is still green, still dim, still creates the tunnel effect that limited visibility to 50 yards in August 1944. The dimensions have not changed. The geometry that made the ambush possible remains intact. The commune around Mortain is quiet now. The village itself holds approximately 1,600 residents, a population that has fluctuated over the decades, but that has never again reached the concentration of humanity present during those August days when American and German forces contested every lane, every field, every hedgerow. The Kansai River still flows nearby, its waters clear, its banks lined with the same species of trees that provided cover for advancing infantry 80 years ago. The countryside has healed, as countryside does. The violence that saturated this land has left few visible traces, but the lane remembers. Ground holds what happened on it in ways that defy rational explanation, but that anyone who has walked a battlefield understands intuitively. The specific location where the haystack stood cannot be determined with certainty. The after-action reports noted its position relative to landmarks that may no longer exist, and the farm that owned the equipment may have changed hands multiple times since 1944. The manure cart that served as a range marker has long since rotted away or been replaced. Nothing visible connects the contemporary lane to the events of August 7, 1944, yet the space itself persists. The sunken road runs where it has always run, following contours determined by drainage patterns and property lines established in the medieval period. Walkers who traverse it today pass through air that once contained the backblast of a bazooka rocket, the smoke of a burning tank, the screams of men whose clothing had ignited. They cannot know this from any physical evidence. They can know it only from records, from the interrogation transcripts archived in military repositories, from the after-action reports preserved in divisional histories, from the fragments of testimony that have survived the decades. The bazooka team itself left few traces in the historical record. The loader and gunner who executed the ambush were not named in the after-action reports that documented the engagement. Such reports typically recorded unit actions rather than individual contributions, identifying participants only by rank and sometimes by surname. Whether either man survived the war cannot be determined from the available sources. The 30th Infantry Division suffered over 1,800 casualties during the week of fighting around Mortain, and the division would continue to fight across France, into Belgium, through the Battle of the Bulge, and into Germany itself. The odds that both members of the team survived to VE Day are calculable, but not encouraging. What soldiers said about such engagements, when they said anything at all, tended toward understatement. The 11 seconds that destroyed 2 tanks and killed or wounded 3 of their 10 crewmen were not exceptional by the standards of hedgerow combat. They were not the kind of action that drew awards or commendations. They were simply the work, the grinding, terrifying, technically demanding work of fighting armour without armour, of closing to ranges where the weapon functioned, of maintaining composure while a 50-ton killing machine approached within yards of your position. Veterans of such actions, interviewed decades later, often refused to discuss the details. They spoke in generalities. It was bad, we did what we had to do, a lot of good men didn't make it. The specific images, the muzzle flash reflected in a tank's vision port, the moment when the rocket left the launcher and the backblast announced your position to anyone within earshot, the sound of steel penetrating steel, and the screams that followed. These were stored in compartments that most survivors chose not to open. The German survivors left more extensive records, at least initially. The interrogation transcripts captured their experience in detail, preserving for posterity the terror of the shaped charge jet, the chaos of the fire, the psychological collapse that followed the immobilization of the second tank. But these men too were eventually repatriated. They returned to a Germany that was rebuilding itself, that was deliberately not speaking about what had happened during the war, that offered few forums for veterans to process their experiences. What the surviving tank crewmen said in later decades, if they said anything at all, is not captured in accessible archives. Their testimony from August 1944 remains frozen in time, preserved in documents that were classified for decades and that have only gradually become available to researchers. The gap between memory and documentation defines all historical events, but it is particularly acute for moments of violence. The 11 seconds that the reports describe were experienced by the participants as a continuous, overwhelming present, a flood of sensation, emotion, and physical response that defied the sequential logic of narrative. The Americans experienced trigger pull, recoil, the flash of the rocket, the reload sequence, the second shot, the withdrawal. The Germans experienced catastrophe, fire, pain, decision, action. Neither side experienced what the documents describe, a tactical engagement with identifiable phases and analysable outcomes. They experienced chaos that resolved itself only in retrospect, only when the after-action reports imposed structure on what had been structureless. This is the irreducible problem of historical recovery. The lane near Mortain exists, the embankments are real, the dimensions can be measured, but the 11 seconds that occurred there in August 1944 are gone, experienced once, imperfectly remembered, inadequately documented, now accessible only through the fragmentary records that survived the war and the decades that followed. What those records cannot capture is what it felt like to be there, to be the man with the bazooka waiting for the tank to reach the marker, to be the driver in the lead tank hearing the impact that announced your imminent death, to be the commander of the second tank watching the turret swing toward a target the gun could not reach. The place holds these experiences in the way that all places hold what happened on them, not physically, not in any way that can be detected or measured, but persistently, irreducibly, as a fact about the world that persists whether or not anyone remains to remember it. The lane does not know that 11 seconds of violence occurred within its banks on a foggy August morning. The hedgerows do not remember the men who used them for concealment or the men who died trying to traverse them. The ground is indifferent. It holds what it holds without consciousness, without intention, without narrative. And yet something persists. The coordinates where the ambush occurred can be approximated from documentary evidence. A person could stand today within meters of where the haystack was positioned, within meters of where the first tank burned, within meters of where 7 men emerged from their vehicles into the silence that follows violence. They would see nothing but a lane, a hedgerow, filtered green light. They would feel nothing but the cool air that moves through the Norman bocage even in summer. They would have no direct evidence that they stood on contested ground, on soil that absorbed the blood of young men whose names may or may not be recoverable from the archival record. But they would be standing where it happened. The physical fact of the place contains the historical fact of the event. The 11 seconds are not repeated, cannot be recovered, will never be fully understood. They were not filmed. They were not narrated in real time. They exist only in documents that describe them from multiple perspectives without fully capturing any of them. But they occurred, in this place, in dimensions that have not changed, under light that filters through the same species of trees, in air that circulates through the same narrow channel between the same earthen walls. The tanks are gone. The men are gone or aged beyond recognition or dead. The weapons have been melted down or preserved in museums or lost. The war has ended. The peace has been won and contested and renegotiated. The world has transformed itself multiple times since those 11 seconds elapsed. Everything has changed, but the lane continues. It runs where it has always run, serving purposes that have evolved but that still include the fundamental function of providing passage through terrain that otherwise resists movement. Farmers use it. Walkers use it. Perhaps occasionally historians or battlefield tourists use it, seeking to stand where the ambush occurred, to see what the bazooka team saw, to understand through physical presence what cannot be understood through documents alone. They stand in the lane. They look up at the embankments, down at the worn earth, forward into the green tunnel that limits visibility. They imagine the sound of tank treads. They imagine the smell of exhaust, of cordite, of burning fuel. They imagine 11 seconds that cannot be imagined because they were not experienced and cannot be recovered. The lane holds what it holds. The war is over. The men who fought it have taken their experiences into whatever silence follows life. What remains is ground, contested once, quiet now, holding without consciousness or intention the fact of what occurred there on a morning in August 1944, when 2 men with a bazooka waited in a haystack for 2 tanks that would never reach their destination. The embankments rise, the hedgerows filter the light, the lane extends forward and backward, connecting to other lanes, to roads, to a countryside that has absorbed its history without forgetting it entirely. Somewhere in archives dispersed across continents, documents preserve fragments of 11 seconds. Somewhere in the soil, perhaps, traces remain that no instrument has detected. Somewhere in the memory of the place itself, if places can be said to remember, the ambush persists, not as narrative, not as meaning, but as fact. 2 tanks entered this lane. Neither emerged. That is what the ground knows. That is what the ground holds. That in the end is what remains.